Chapter 644. Sulu reached out his hand and lightly shook hands with this empire man called Chi Dabing before quickly letting go. Although there was no explosive incident that happened when their palms touched, and there was no explosive blast of air, the two of them remained silent and calm. There was a strange atmosphere rising between their brows. They had met before. Last year, they had met in the underground sewers outside Feng Lake. At that time, Su Li's identity was a fugitive from the Federation who was being pursued by countless Empire troops, while Chi Dabing was an elite combat force that the Bureau of Mobility had specially recruited from the Royal Special Forces. They had suddenly met and fought fiercely. The sharp and ruthless images flashed in the dark underground sewers. In the end, Chi Dabing was no match for Su Lu. He was kicked in the chest by Su Lu and fell into the sewers. Logically speaking, in that tense and dark environment, it was very difficult for Su Lu to remember an enemy who had fallen in front of him like so many others. However, he did remember it very clearly. This was because the combat strength this Empire officer had displayed, especially those close combat techniques that he felt were extremely familiar with, had once given him many guesses. "I am Su Lu. We've met before, and I think you should know who I am," said Su Lu calmly as he looked at this Empire man who gave off a dangerous feeling. Chi Dabing's sharp gaze did not soften because of the handshake. He nodded and replied, "Last year in the underground sewers, I've seen your strength, Colonel Su Lu. I heard that you doubt the ability of the organization, so I think there is a need for you to know that the Wolf Fang outside the walls of Great Master Fan's manor belongs to me." "Thank you." Su Lu could guess why the other party had suddenly brought up this matter at this time. He did not mind expressing his gratitude. However, it was very clear that simple gratitude could not reduce Chi Dabing's wariness and resistance from who knew where. He looked coldly at Su Lu and said, "In order to enter the upper echelons of the Empire's military, I've put in many years of hard work. In order to save you, a Federation citizen, all of these efforts have turned into ashes. If, in the future, it turns out that we have not received a fair return for the price we paid, I think for your safety, it would be best for you not to return to the Empire." It was a very direct and obvious personal threat, but Su Lu appeared to be somewhat indifferent. In the Federation, he had long since experienced the principle that only light wind and clouds could be spouted from the barrel of a gun. Although this Empire man in front of him was very clearly an important figure in the resistance organization and had great strength, in the end, he was still just a defeated opponent. His interest in this man had actually always been in other aspects. He glanced at Chi Dabing's wrist from the corner of his eye and saw a metal watch band. He frowned slightly. The final light of dusk shrouded the side corridor on the second floor. The old man in the wheelchair clearly felt the tit-for-tat emotions between the two people, but he did not say anything. It was only when he saw Su Lu frown that he slowly raised his right arm and said with a smile, "I introduced you to each other because in the many years to come, you may be partners in cooperation. Even if you don't like each other, you have to accept this reality." At this time, Muan received a call. He glanced at Su Lu, lowered his body, and whispered a few words into the old man's ear. Then, he said goodbye and left. Su Lu looked downstairs and saw Muan's figure leaving the repair shop under the protection of more than 10 armed subordinates. He suddenly asked, "There's no danger, right? It's not convenient to find a spaceship now, but if there's anyone on this planet who can find the last spaceship, that person must be Muan." Old Man Worth gently stroked the wheelchair and said with a smile, "You don't have to worry too much." Chi Dabing said coldly from the side, "What you need to do now is to stay here obediently and act according to our arrangements. You have to remember that any action you take without permission may cause our people to pay the price in blood." It was obviously a very correct statement, but for some reason, when it came out of Chi Dabing's mouth, it had a spicy and hard taste, making the listener feel very depressed. It was as if they had just eaten a large piece of white meat that had been soaked in chili oil for 20 years, however, Su Lu still had no reaction. He continued to talk to Leader Voss in a low voice, not even glancing at this proud Empire man. Chi Dabing, who was ignored, stared at Su Li's back, which was just inches away from him, and slowly clenched his hands that were exposed outside his sleeves. The resistance organization has infiltrated many people into the military and various departments over the years, but only Qi Dabing is close to the core and gradually gained the trust of the palace. This time, because of you, he was forced to be exposed, and his years of hard work were ruined. Naturally, he is in a bad mood. I hope you can understand. Leader Worth and Su Lu sat in the dark room. No one wanted to see a big internal conflict in the empire under the tense situation of increasingly tight search, so Qi Dabing was left outside the door. Su Lu glanced at the contact information in his hand and roughly confirmed that if the Federation government and the Empire Resistance Organization started to cooperate, that proud empire man called Qi Dabing would play a very important role. According to the sad feeling of the old man in front of him, that person might even become the next leader of the resistance organization. In the Federation, I have seen a lot of excellent spies. Shi Qinghai's beautiful face appeared in his mind. Su Lu smiled slightly, raised his head, and said, even the stupidest woman is much better at controlling her emotions than Qi Dabing, so I am very curious how he could hide in the Empire's military for so long. I also don't understand why you dared to give him such an important mission. Dabing is a student of an old friend of mine. He has his reasons to be proud, and he also has the qualifications to be trusted by me and my comrades. Elder Worth's health was obviously not good, and he replied tiredly, maybe it's because he lost to you in the underground waterway last time. He, who has never failed in his goal of pursuing the princess, feels a little inconceivable and troubled. The gap between him and Huai Chaoshi is very big. Su Lu directly made his own judgment, paused for a moment, and suddenly said, his teacher, your old friend, who is he? Elder Worth slowly raised his head, and there was a look of understanding in his cloudy eyes, but in the end, he just shook his head. The other party was not willing to say, and Su Lu could not force the old man to speak by holding a knife to his neck. Some kind of annoyance and disappointment, and even a little bit of sourness, reverberated and settled in his chest, causing his mood to become gloomy. Su Lu pushed open the door and saw Qi Dabing standing in the dim corridor. He narrowed his eyes and was no longer willing to hide his gaze. He stared directly at Qi Dabing's wrist and strode forward. Can I take a look at the watch you're wearing? Su Lu stared into Qi Dabing's eyes and asked. His words seemed polite, but his attitude was tough, which was not in line with his tough personality at all. No. Qi Dabing stood against the wall with a contemptuous and calm attitude on his face. His right foot was relaxed on the wall, and his answer was very slow, but it seemed more tough than Su Lu. Su Lu was silent for a moment, and then continued to ask, can I know who you learned your close combat skills from? This time, Qi Dabing was too lazy to answer his question. He directly shook his head coldly. The range of his movement was very small, and it seemed like he was looking down on him. Su Lu pursed his thin lips and nodded with some unknown meaning. After a moment of silence, he suddenly opened his mouth and said, your posture is very similar to one of my brothers, but I advise you not to do such a thing in the future, because you're not as good-looking as him, and you don't have those few strands of greasy hair in front of your forehead. Most importantly, if you were to fight on the battlefield, you would definitely be killed by him, so you don't have the right to copy such an arrogant posture. When Qi Dabing heard this, his pupils suddenly shrank. He stared at Su Li's face that did not have any outstanding features. Although he had seen Su Lu burst out of the fan manner that day and already knew that this person's strength was abnormally fierce, he really did not expect that in the underground base of the resistance organization, this person from the Federation would dare to humiliate him so wantonly. Without hesitation, Qi Dabing flipped his right arm and retracted his elbow, turning it into a whistling elbow blade, and fiercely chopped towards Su Li's neck. Su Li's eyes suddenly brightened, and his left foot suddenly stomped down. If the plank under his foot was a boat, the boat might have capsized immediately. A huge force came from the bottom of his foot, and it pushed his body forward with a whistling sound. His left arm stretched out like lightning, and struck directly under Qi Dabing's armpit. Bang! 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 A series of dense muffled sounds rang out in the quiet and dim corridor. The two of them turned into two strange, twisting shadows that tried to avoid each other as they fought in the narrow space. It was only a matter of a moment. Chi Dabing forcefully suppressed a muffled groan, took 3 steps back, and fell heavily to the ground. A stream of blood flowed out from the corner of his mouth. Sulu, who was expressionless and slightly lowered his head, stepped forward again with a terrifying calmness. His left hand flipped, and his right hand grabbed Chi Dabing's elbow joint. With a precise and fierce grab, he quickly took off the watch on Chi Dabing's wrist. On a certain night last year in the underground waterway, the two of them had a fierce fight. But at that time, Sulu had lost a lot of blood, had not recovered from his serious injuries, and was in his weakest state due to hunger and cold. At this time, although he had also been seriously injured by Huai Chaosher, his condition was much better than that time. The most important thing was that this time, it was rare for him to take the initiative to provoke him. He had prepared in advance to take the initiative to attack, and it was with a sense of resentment and depression. How could Chi Dabing be his opponent? Chi Dabing, who was holding the wall to prevent himself from falling, looked at him with a strong sense of unwillingness and pain. His clenched left hand trembled slightly, but he maintained enough consciousness to not rush forward again. Sulu did not look at him at all. He just quietly looked at the watch in his palm. His eyebrows gradually furrowed, but his narrowed eyes gradually relaxed. His expression was a little strange. Chapter 645. There was a watch lying quietly in his open palm. It was an old-style cheap electronic watch from an unknown light machine factory. There were many lines engraved on the dial, but there were no numbers. Although it was cheap, it was very durable. The slender hand tirelessly walked in circles under the influence of the weak current of the battery. It walked for so many years without stopping. It was like a planet orbiting around a star. It was also like people repeating scenes of parting in their lives. Sulu silently looked at the watch in his palm. He looked at the moving hand and the familiar electrolyte stain on the band. His heart beat faster and faster in his chest. A familiar voice that he had not heard for many years reappeared in his mind. This voice was buzzing and seemed to come from an empty underground mine. Of course I'm alive. I'm alive forever. The middle-aged boss, whose tools were hanging behind his blue overalls, made a clanging sound in the wind. When they parted in the mine that autumn day, he casually threw the incredible bracelet to him and took off the cheap watch that the youth had worn for many years. Then he said a lot of complicated and literary words. Sulu had forgotten those words, but the one that left the deepest impression on him was this declaration that seemed sad at the time, but now it was arrogant and flirtatious. In the last words, Feng Yu thought that his eyebrows were like knives. They were too straight and would suppress his vision and hurt his spirit. If he could change them, then he should change them. A few years later, Sulu was once again an orphan crying in sorrow. His pair of knife-like eyebrows were shaved sparsely because of his disguise, but the real him in the depths of his soul was still as straight as knives and had never changed. Looking at the watch in his palm, his expression was very strange. His knife-like eyebrows gradually furrowed. They were furrowed so tightly that he felt a burst of pain between his eyebrows. "Give me back the watch." Chi Dabing noticed his strange expression. He looked at the watch and shouted anxiously. Sulu still did not pay attention to him. He turned around and walked in with an expressionless face. "Who is Chi Dabing? Why do you value him so much? If I want to find his teacher, how should I find him? And, how much do you know about this watch?" The old man behind the table raised his head in confusion. When he saw the watch in Su Li's hand, he tilted his head slightly as if he was thinking about something in the past. For some reason, the age spots on his face became clearer under the dim light. "Isn't this the soldier's most precious watch? Why is it in your hands? As for his identity, well, there's nothing special about it. He just has a very faint royal bloodline, which the entire organization knows. The cold wind blew in the spacious conference room, and the heat outside the window could not enter at all. In the dim conference room, dozens of stern-looking imperial officers could be vaguely seen, but no noise could be heard. The discipline of the imperial armies was fully displayed at this moment. The thin screen in front of them kept scrolling through images and summaries of information. A high-definition picture of an imperial officer with a cold expression stayed at the top of the scrolling image. Beside the picture was an annotation of his identity: Qi Dabing, former vice-captain of the 4th Brigade of the Imperial Special Forces, latest recipient of the Imperial Gold Star Medal. According to the joint investigation of the military and the intelligence bureau, this person is confirmed to be an important figure in the traitorous organization. The latest information shows that he should still be in the capital. As the information on the screen scrolled through, the high-ranking officer in charge of the conference said in a deep voice, "There's one thing I need to remind everyone. This traitor may have a little royal bloodline in him. This is being confirmed by the Badge Administration Bureau, but, according to the wise instructions of His Highness, this can be ignored in this operation." In the quiet venue, dozens of disciplined officers finally made some sounds of discussion at this time. However, at this moment, someone suddenly turned on the lights, and the originally dark venue suddenly became bright and dazzling. The general frowned and looked towards the door. Just as he was about to explode in anger, he saw the indifferent expression of the young officer. His heart clenched, and he performed a standard military salute and said loudly, "Your Highness." Huai Chaoshi looked at him and asked, "3 minutes ago, the Intelligence Bureau sent the latest information to your terminal. You, on the other hand, are still talking about 3 hours of information. However, your people still haven't done anything. I need an explanation." The Imperial General immediately felt cold sweat seeping out of his back. Everyone in the military knew that after the secret incident at Master Fan's manor a few days ago, Her Royal Highness had endured enormous pressure and resolutely pushed back the date of her arrival to the front lines indefinitely. As for the real reason, it was obvious that Her Royal Highness had doubts about her ability to act. The terrain there is complicated, and the buildings are densely packed. The most important thing is that there are too many residents. The general lowered his voice and explained respectfully, "Furthermore, the citizens of District 9 have never been obedient. The general staff is currently formulating the best plan." The District 9 that the Empire's ruling class was talking about was the slum that occupied a corner of planet Tianjing. It was like a rotten ulcer that disgusted people, but couldn't be removed. Huai Chaoshi frowned slightly and looked at the general in silence. The entire conference room was silent, and the atmosphere became more and more oppressive. When everyone was about to be unable to bear the pressure, she said coldly, "There's never a perfect plan. A plan that can kill Su Lu is a good plan. I only care about the results. I don't care how many people will die in the process. I've already told you everything I know about Qi Dabing. As for this watch, it was sent to me by an old friend a few years ago. I think that since Dabing is his student, he should be more qualified to wear it than I am." Su Lu silently looked at the old man behind the chair. He could tell from the other's expression that this wasn't a lie. For some reason, he suddenly felt tired. He shook his head but didn't say anything. "I don't know where this old friend of mine is, young man." This old man, who had led the underground resistance against the powerful Empire's machinery for decades, looked at the expression on Su Li's face. For some reason, he felt a little sad. He continued, "From the incident at the Great Master Fan Manor, I guessed that there might be some kind of relationship between you two. However, I never understood. One of you is from the Empire, and the other is from the Federation. Could it be that you've met before?" His current identity was that of the Empire's. Su Lu walked out of the room with narrowed eyes. There was a strange smile at the corner of his lips. In reality, it wasn't completely a smile. "Return the watch to me." Qi Dabing blocked his path. Although he didn't pull out the pistol in his clothes, he looked anxious and angry. If Sulu could fulfill his request, perhaps this person would really go crazy. Sulu looked at him but didn't do anything. This watch is very meaningful to me. Please return it to me. Chi Dabing suppressed the anger in his heart and tried to lower his posture as much as possible. Sulu used 2 fingers to pick up the cheap watch and put it in front of his eyes. However, he didn't seem to have any intention of handing it over. Instead, he used an extremely serious tone and said word by word, "This is my watch." Chi Dabing was stunned. And he didn't send this watch to you as a souvenir. He just wanted to tell me a truth that I wanted to know before, but now makes me angry. Chi Dabing wasn't in the mood to ask for a truth. He angrily clenched his fists and asked in a cold voice, "What right do you have to say that it's yours?" There was the crisp sound of metal colliding. The back cover of the watch that Sulu was holding opened with a snap, revealing the glossy watch case and a very clear but ugly line of words on it. 37th Constitution Calendar, 61st Year, September 3rd, Future Federation Mechanic Sulu. This is the first souvenir I made after I operated the micro-etching machine for the first time. Sulu looked at him expressionlessly. Do you still think it's yours? When did you meet that person? Sulu looked down at the watch and asked calmly. 6 years old, Chi Dabing replied coldly. When I was 6 years old, he stayed in my house for a month. No wonder I felt that your close combat skills were a bit strange in the underground sewers. Chi Dabing had not completely digested the shock in his heart, but it was very difficult for him to accept that this person from the Federation, who was much younger than him, was using a lecturing tone to talk to him. He said mockingly, "Looks like you're very interested in this. You want to learn? Beg me. Maybe I'll be willing to teach you a move or two when I'm in a good mood." Sulu looked at him with that strange smile. After a long silence, he said mockingly, "No, I just want to remind you that you learned it wrong. The person who taught you clearly didn't put much effort into it. Perhaps he saw that you have royal blood and wanted to see if he could stimulate the Jinqi in your body. But obviously, you don't have that kind of luck. Only 1 month, but I have 4 years. Sulu raised his head and narrowed his eyes. His mood suddenly became a bit better. A moment later, he immediately felt that this kind of happiness was really very childish. For an orphan who had lost his family at a young age, the man he called boss was actually not only his teacher. In a certain sense, he had also replaced the role of a father. Although that man could only play the role of an extremely incompetent father who liked to visit prostitutes every day and didn't even know how to cook. It was because of this kind of relationship that when the emperor of the empire thought that he was his son and the great teacher said that he was his father, Sulu didn't feel any displeasure in his heart. Instead, he felt somewhat proud and complacent. The most wanted criminal of the Federation, cuckolded the emperor of the empire, gave birth to such a perfect daughter like Jian Shuier, and had thousands of incarnations. His entire theory was enough to guide the guerrillas of Green Dragon Mountain. After his death, he was still able to make countless young students of the Federation worship him like a god. With his own strength, he had fought against the glory of the Charter for countless years. Such a powerful person, had lived together with him for so many years and had such a close and irreplaceable relationship. It was really something to be proud of. He had always thought that he was the only student of the uncle, so when he discovered that there was still a person like Chi Dabing in the empire, his disgust, depression, and rebellious feelings suddenly surged. He subconsciously wanted to beat him into oblivion. After putting the watch back into his pocket, he didn't pay attention to the strange and angry expression of Chi Dabing behind him. He walked out of the building alone and stood by the railing alone. He looked at the gradually darkening night in front of him and didn't say anything for a long time. At this moment, his mood was very complicated. He knew that Bastard should still be alive, so he naturally felt relieved. He also knew that the Bastard had taken in a disciple before. Although it was very obvious that he had taken in a random disciple, he still felt very unhappy. With his palm on the railing, Yi Feng narrowed his eyes. Countless emotions converged into a sincere sentence, and he softly said from his thin lips, "Fuck you, uncle." Chapter 646. Some people were alive, but he was already dead. Some people were dead, but he was still alive. When everyone thought he was dead, he showed his face from behind the dark curtain with a cigarette in his mouth and a glass of red wine in his hand. He told the world in a flirtatious yet indifferent manner that he was still alive and would live forever. Other than that, the reason why Su Li's mood was very complicated was that he was surprised to find that after that bastard faked his death or left, there were still many people in this universe who missed him. Those people were confused by his halo and became hot-headed, and their eyes were fixed on him. Fortunately, he was not such a person. He curled his lips into a smile, so he did not scream and rush into the slums of the Imperium and ask around for news with his watch until he burst into tears. Instead, he calmly put the watch into his pocket, shrugged like Lan Xiaolong, put his hands on the railing, and cursed at the hot and smelly night wind of District 9 with an inexplicable bad feeling. When he cursed, his pupils shrank, and his hands on the railing suddenly tightened. On the street outside the repair shop, an extremely expensive car was roaring at high speed. It seemed that the driver heard him greeting someone's mother. He was so shocked that he lost control of the car and slammed into the hard tree trunk outside the gate, making a loud noise. The hard tree snapped, and the front of the expensive car was severely damaged. The resistance fighters disguised as repair shop workers quickly rushed out of the shop and struggled to pull the deformed alloy door. A furious roar sounded in the car. Muen covered his forehead and face with blood. At this time, he did not care that the expensive fur coat on his body had been torn to pieces. He anxiously and violently waved his arms and said something loudly. Su Lu narrowed his eyes and felt that some kind of danger was approaching the repair shop. He turned around and ran into the building without hesitation. Almost at the same time, the alarm bell on the railing behind him rang loudly. This meant that the Imperial armies had found this secret base. Time was of the essence. The resistance members in the repair shop did not have any time to say goodbye. They packed up their weapons and luggage as fast as they could, and then opened the tunnel entrance hidden under the repair platform. "Why are we retreating separately?" Qi Dabing looked at the old man in the wheelchair angrily. He held his gun tightly and said, "You can't move, so you should follow us. Because we're all very important, so I have to be prepared for the worst. If the Empire catches you, this old man might be able to slip away." The age spots on Leader Vasa's face were very bright under the dim light of the tunnel. He looked at his subordinates gently and said, "The Empire has never caught me, and it won't this time either. When it comes to escaping, you youngsters don't have as much experience as me." The soldiers of the resistance organization all laughed. This kind of relaxed and confident atmosphere in the face of life and death infected Su Lu, who had been silent all this time. He silently thought that the underground resistance organization was like the anti-government guerrillas of Green Dragon Mountain. If they did not have this kind of optimistic and cheerful fighting spirit, they would not have been able to hold on for so long in such a disadvantageous situation. "Goodbye," he said sincerely as he looked at the old man in the wheelchair. "We will meet again." The old man nodded with a smile. "Don't worry. The base is often found by those foxes from the Intelligence Bureau. We move around often, so we are very experienced. Don't worry about Mr. Muen. This repair shop is not registered under his name, and I think he should be able to escape faster than us." The one who was speaking was Muen, the most capable person in the gang. He was wearing a gloomy black suit in the gloomy tunnel, and he gave off a sinister feeling from the beginning to the end. But for a group of soldiers who were escaping from the Imperial armies, having such a person as a guide would make them feel a lot calmer. Following the repair shop's tunnel to the west, a group of more than 10 members of the resistance organization surrounded Su Lu and did not stop for a moment. Their reaction was very fast, and their speed was also very fast. The Imperial troops who had killed their way into the slums would not be able to keep up with them. An old but still well-sealed iron door fell heavily behind them, isolating them from the sound and air. The fugitives, whose foreheads were already starting to sweat, finally felt a sense of relief. Muan's capable subordinate pulled open his collar and took a few quick breaths. Then, he took out a cigarette and distributed it to the crowd. He chuckled and said, "Let's leave this place. We are already safe. We use a different ventilation system here, and the electronic smell detector that the army brought cannot detect us. So, comrades, relax and smoke." The relaxation after the tense run made everyone in a good mood. Several old soldiers of the resistance organization stepped on the dirty water and smoked while humming a song in a low voice. Chi Dabing, who had been gloomy all this time, finally relaxed a little. The Empire's cigarettes taste pretty good, Sulu thought with a smile as he looked at the smoke rising from his fingers and drifting behind him. Listening to the interesting little song that was repeated in the Empire's mouth, he couldn't help but purse his lips, wanting to hum a few lines along. However, the moment his lips parted, a violent vibration came from the ground, violently pushing everyone to the ground and into the dirty water. The well-trained resistance organization soldiers did not panic. They struggled to get up, quickly picked up their guns, and began to set up a defense. At the same time, the technicians began to monitor what had happened. The resistance fighter with a round face looked at the Bonner watch on his wristwatch in shock. With a trembling voice, he said, "An explosion too. 4 kilometers to the southeast. It's so strong when it reached us. How many bombs did the Imperial Thief Army use this time?" There was silence in the dark underground tunnel. Chi Dabing had a portable workbench on his knee. The faint light made his face look particularly pale. He looked at the remote monitoring screen on the workbench, and sadness appeared on his face. A missile with an unconventional yield flew from beyond the clouds and accurately hit the southern part of the repair factory building. The violent explosion instantly destroyed all the buildings on the ground of the repair factory, and the powerful shockwave turned the courtyard walls into countless jagged cement blocks. The terrifying temperature coldly turned most of the resistance soldiers into charcoal. Thick black smoke rose from the ruins and slowly drifted into the sky. It entered the eyes of countless confused people in the slums and then gradually dispersed, covering the warm and free sun in the sky. The underground tunnel deep in the ruins of the repair factory was directly overturned by this terrifying explosion. It was exposed to the air filled with a burnt smell. Many corpses of the resistance organization soldiers were lying there. Weak shouts, sporadic gunshots, and dozens of huge wolf fang mechs rushed into the courtyard and cruelly and coldly began the final massacre. Chapter 647. There were still people alive in the rubble and smoke-filled repair shop. The shrill sound of bullets firing rang out, piercing through the black smoke and striking the hard armor of the wolf fang mecha. The sound was muffled and loud, but it could only create a few small sparks, not even leaving a deep mark. In a battle where the difference in power was too great, the scattered firepower of the resistance group looked abnormally pitiful. It was like a despairing insect waiting for death, futilely spitting out a few drops of venom against an elephant that was countless times its own weight, and yet the elephant could not feel it at all. That wolf fang mecha abruptly stopped its heavy mechanical legs, the gun on its left mechanical arm firing out. The terrifying firepower instantly blasted that ruined wall into flying shards. As for the resistance group soldiers behind the wall, they did not even have time to scream before they became dismembered corpses. The humming of the engine, the heavy mechanical legs of the mecha landing on the ground, the muffled and cold sounds of gunfire, explosions, all these sounds were frightening, because there were no more gunshots or shouts from the resistance group among these sounds. Gradually, this solemn and terrifying massacre came to an end. Dozens of wolf fang mecha cleared out the resistance within the repair shop in the shortest amount of time possible, and then they quickly spread out, occupying the various key points of this block. Among them, several of the electronic mecha began to activate their high-powered surveillance equipment, attempting to find the direction of those complicated tunnels below the repair shop. Right at this moment, the faint rumbling of heavy engineering mecha could be heard from behind the block, mixed with the almost inaudible sound of grinding tires. The gate of the repair shop, which had long been on the verge of collapse, collapsed with a crash. As the smoke and dust settled, Huai Chaoshe, wearing a military cap and an indifferent expression, stepped in under the protection of countless stern-looking soldiers, walking towards the south. The high wall on the south side of the repair shop had long been reduced to dust by that terrifying missile attack. The exposed steel bars hung mournfully, its usually hard head facing the shallow pond outside the wall. That terrifying explosion had occurred here, and now it was a terrifying black crater that billowed with smoke and dust. The water in the small shallow pond had long been burned clean by the high temperature of the explosion, revealing the thousand-year-old mud underneath. The mud had already dried up and cracked open, like the windless and poor fields around the desert. Huai Chaoshe stood on the charred shore with his hands behind his back. He lowered his head and looked at the cracked soil at the bottom of the pond. He looked at the overturned tunnel in front of the pond. He looked at the strangely shaped charred corpses and the few people who were still breathing under the broken tunnel. He frowned slightly. The tunnel was directly blown up by the missile. Most of the 60-odd resistance fighters who escorted the leader died instantly. As for the old man and a few of his most loyal subordinates, they were also blown away by the explosion because they were at the forefront. They fell in the ruins of the tunnel, covered in blood, but fortunately, they didn't die on the spot. However, this was perhaps the greatest misfortune. Old Voss lay on the ground on the verge of death. His face was smeared with mud and blood. The obvious and ugly age spots and the fair skin that gave him the beginnings of a lowly life but courageously challenged the unfair order could no longer be seen clearly. His pants were burned to ashes by the burning flames. His legs, which were paralyzed in the war with the Empire in the early years, were badly burned. His black and red skin was smoking. His amazing willpower kept the old man from fainting. He stared at the young Empire officer walking towards him from the top of the tunnel and vaguely guessed the identity of the other party. His weak breathing suddenly became rapid. His old right hand weakly grabbed the soil on the ground, as if he wanted to grab something and hit something. The Empire soldier guarding him noticed his movements. He lowered his body and slapped him hard. The loud slap made the old man's face tilt to the side. Huai Chaoshe waved her arm, indicating the people around her to disperse. She walked in front of Leader Voss alone and looked at him quietly. After a long time, she said indifferently, "Let me introduce myself. I am Huai Chaoshe." Old Voss's bloodied lips moved slightly. A strange look flashed in his eyes, but he didn't speak in the end. "I know who you are." Huai Chaoshe continued indifferently, "The Empire has allowed you to escape for so many years, not because we can't catch you, but because we need you to stir up some people and do things that are inconvenient for us to do. But if we really want to catch you, how can you escape?" The light in old Voss's eyes gradually faded. He knew that this princess didn't need to lie to him before he died. His heart that had long been prepared to sacrifice itself gradually became a little lost. Since his youth, he had devoted himself to the liberation of the lower class of the empire. He didn't know how many times he had escaped the pursuit of the imperial armies and secret police. He led 7 large and small uprisings or riots. He led hot-blooded students and farmers to secretly execute hundreds of greedy and cruel nobles. He was injured and imprisoned under an alias, but he watched as the future of the liberation cause became dimmer and dimmer. Yet, he didn't regret it for a moment. Until the moment of his death, when he heard Huai Chaoshe's indifferent words, Leader Voss finally understood why he had been able to escape for so many years without dying. "Where is that person from the Federation?" Huai Chaoshe squatted down. Her gaze was like a knife. "Where are you going to send him away?" Old Voss didn't answer her question. After a long silence, the light that belonged only to him returned to his eyes. Before he died, he finally understood something. Even if his life was to some extent used by the royal family, the things he did were always valuable. Voss, when I saw your file, as a member of the royal family, I couldn't help but admire you because you used to have a backbone. Hui Chaoshu looked at the change in the old man's expression and knew that he would never say what she wanted. She frowned slightly and said in a cold voice, "The battle between us is ultimately a battle between the people of the empire. But I didn't expect that you would do such a disappointing thing when you're old. Colluding with the people of the empire, betraying the interests of your own people, and for your own political ideas, you didn't hesitate to commit treason. Don't you feel ashamed?" Hui Caoshu's anger was very real. Leader Voss, who was lying on the ground, looked at the high and distant sky indifferently. He seemed to be thinking about how to answer the princess's anger, but also seemed to be thinking about whether his decision to cooperate with the Federation was right or wrong. After a long time, old Voss turned his head with difficulty and looked at Hui Chaoshu. His turbid eyes revealed a trace of determination and mockery. He said in a hoarse voice, "Betray the country? This is your country, never the country of lowly people like us. Your Highness, can you find a reason for lowly people like us to love this country? But after all, you are all people of the empire. You were born here and grew up here. Is this the reason why maggots must love a cesspool?" The old man breathed rapidly. His eyes gradually became hollow, and his hands weakly scratched the scorched earth beside him. He looked at Hui Chaoshu and said, "What I want to do in this life is not to prove that I am great, but to take back what we have lost. I don't want to continue living in a cesspool. Gods belong to gods, His Majesty belongs to His Majesty. What belongs to lowly people like us? Dear Your Highness, if you are willing to return the power that belongs to us, you will definitely find that our determination to resist the invasion of the Federation is stronger than you think. The words of cowardly traitors are always so beautiful." Hui Chaoshu looked at the leader of the resistance organization under her feet, indifferently made a final mocking comment, and then turned around and left. The soldiers of the resistance organization habitually called the military officials loyal to the royal family as imperial traitors, and they themselves were called traitors. From today onwards, there would be one more crime on the wanted list: treason. Old Voss had led the resistance organization for decades, and at the last moment, he made a shocking decision to cooperate with the invaders of the Federation. Although he had temporarily obtained the approval of most of the members of the organization due to his supreme authority, the crime of being a traitor, the crime of being the precursor of an invader, would follow him and his organization forever and ever. Was this really the right thing to do? Was it really worth it? The old man couldn't answer this question. The spiraling gunshots from the bottom of the dry pond ended his life full of fighting spirit, and also left this question to the successor of the resistance organization and the soldiers with complicated feelings. The soldiers who were desperately running in the tunnel naturally couldn't hear the gunshots. But from the images of the large explosion transmitted from the remote monitoring, as well as the fire, black smoke, and scattered limbs, they had long guessed the worst outcome in their hearts. That old man who was like a loving father, no, really like a loving father, who had led them and even their fathers to fight for decades, should have already dedicated his life to the cause of the liberation of the people. The soldiers glanced at Chi Dabing with stiff bodies, silently making painful inquiries. Chi Dabing, who glanced at the screen from the corner of his eyes from time to time, had long become numb from the pain and sorrow in the depths of his heart, and didn't have any reaction. Therefore, the people who were running for their lives did not stop. The dense sound of footsteps continued in the dark tunnel. No one spoke, and no one cried out crazily or turned around to try and save something. Everyone continued to run on their own, silently running. There seemed to be no end to the dark underground tunnel, and there seemed to be no end to the running as well. The terrifying Empire's military mechs on the ground were stepping heavily on the ground. After a long time, someone in the fleeing crowd finally couldn't help but start crying. Su Lo, who had been silent from beginning to end, had a heavy heart. Thinking about how the leader of the resistance organization who didn't have much emotion had died just like that, he couldn't help but think of the words that the great teacher had said that night: everyone has their own historical mission. Then what was his own historical mission? He rubbed his eyebrows that were growing back, and thus appeared even harder than before. He took a sip of water from the soldier beside him, and then, somewhat stunned, he took a cold handgun. Chi Dabing lowered his head and said, "If we all die, you have to make sure you can go back alive." Chapter 648. To the rulers of the empire, the exploited, damaged, and humiliated lower-class people were the source of their dignity, wealth, and power. Just as Elder Worth had said, they could not give up the foundation of this ruling structure. Thus, the sober rulers would sooner or later discover a law of history, or rather a law of physics related to the spring. The resentment and desire for a better life in the lowly people, who occupied a large portion of the population, would inevitably develop into a fierce resistance. Since this was a law of history that could not be violated, they could only accept it and think of a way to control this fluctuation within a certain range. This could release the accumulated energy of the spring after it was compressed, but also prevent the release process from being too violent and directly shattering the golden hands that were pressing the spring. Resistance and suppression were always bloody and cruel. The empire's royal family was unwilling to see flowers of black blood bloom everywhere in the vast territory. An unorganized resistance might seem weak, but in the countless galaxies, it would cause the military and officials to be distracted and exhausted. Furthermore, the Empire's royal family seemed to need these lowly soldiers who dared to charge at warships with crude weapons to wear down the arrogant and disobedient remote nobles. Thus, a mature and powerful resistance organization not only became the final victory against the lowly people, but also the royal family of the Empire needed to maintain their rule. Since many years ago, the master of Tianjing Planet's imperial palace and his powerful and iron-blooded army began to allow some of the highly respected rebel leaders, especially the moderate leaders, to grow freely in the country. They silently observed and even secretly helped them to form disciplined groups. When the nobles of the remote galaxies trembled in front of the rebels, the emperor's royal troops descended from the sky like saviors to save them from danger. When the rebel army grew larger and gradually became a mighty force, the emperor coldly used the most iron-blooded generals and soldiers, not hesitating to slaughter an entire city and piling up hundreds of thousands of people to suppress this momentum. When the rebels fell into a low tide, His Majesty gently announced a benevolent policy, reprimanded the illegal actions of the nobles everywhere, and killed a few thin and weak chickens. Wrapped in the holy light, he won over the hearts of the untouchables. The generals and soldiers who had carried out bloody killings naturally became shameless sheep who deceived His Majesty. When the resistance group was forced to enter the city and gradually expand their influence at the bottom of society, they would truly threaten the rule of the royal family. Or it could be said that the owner of the palace was no longer willing to feed the resistance group and wanted to change to a group of opponents who were less threatening and more incompetent. Then, he would raise his butcher knife again. It was unknown who came up with such a seemingly whimsical and difficult to implement policy, but in fact, it was extremely vicious and shameless. In the 700 years of the White Hibiscus dynasty, countless resistance groups were born along with the tide of history, growing stronger and then being destroyed. Countless people who had automatically entered the most resolute resistance were turned into ashes in this boring and tragic process. All the difference was just the name of the resistance group. This process was like a greedy farmer who had planted thousands of acres of land and was faced with a prairie full of weeds. He had no way to get rid of all the weeds in the field. He would rather have an alien with thoughts, wisdom, and precise purpose appear among the weeds, attracting and leading the weeds in the rest of the fields to gather all their strength and grow lush until they surrounded the farmer's own home. At that time, a lawn mower or a fire would be enough. In the long river of history, there would always be many accidents. For the rulers of the White Hibiscus dynasty, this great purpose that had been set since the beginning of the dynasty had entered a situation where they had lost control many times. The angry and powerful resistance groups had almost succeeded in overthrowing the decaying empire several times. However, the successive owners of the palace still insisted on this policy until today. The latest harvest was a relatively long process. It probably started when the previous emperor was assassinated by Li Pifu and the new emperor succeeded the throne. After that, Duke Cardin brandished his butcher knife and rampaged through the universe. After that, it was the recent story that happened in the slums. Tens of thousands of Imperial soldiers and secret police rushed into the 9th district at the southwest border of the capital city. Those dilapidated buildings that no nobles usually paid attention to became the focus of all eyes in these few days. The merciless purge, on the basis of more than 10 years of suppression and collection by the Intelligence Bureau, was particularly precise and terrifying. More than 600 members of the resistance group disguised as people from various industries were thrown into the gloomy secret prison. What awaited them was inevitable death. There were even more people who were also arrested and shot to death. As for the underground resistance group's secret strongholds, the casinos and factories, they were even more miserable as they were crushed into ruins by the engineering mecca. Sulu stood on the upper floor and looked at the smoke that rose from time to time in the distance. He also heard the cries of the civilians who were injured by stray bullets. His brows were deeply furrowed. He forgot to take a puff of the cigarette between his right index finger and middle finger for a long time. The soft but neat ash trembled slightly, as if it could fall at any time. Contrary to the judgment of the Imperial military and the Intelligence Bureau, the group of people who escaped from the repair shop did not immediately leave the capital city and disperse into the dense forests and mountains in the south. Instead, they continued to stay in the slums. In the past few days, Sulu and the resistance fighters had changed their hiding spots 11 times in a row. Finally, they found a rare opportunity to rest. The slums of the capital city were too big, and there were too many people of all kinds. No matter how pervasive the Empire's cleansing and harvesting operations were, it was impossible for them to clear out this endless stretch of rundown streets. This was because the Emperor couldn't possibly let the soldiers kill over 1 million people. No matter how cheap a person's life was, once there were 1 million of them, it would still have some weight, let alone in the capital of the Empire. It was like a field that had been burned into black charcoal. God would always be merciful enough to leave a few holes and a few lucky grass seeds. In an excellent hiding spot, Sulu silently watched the tragedy unfold before him. After watching for several dozen minutes, his eyes were a bit dry. He furrowed his brows and shook his head. Then, he lowered his head and looked at the cigarette that was about to burn to his fingers. He remained silent. He watched as the slums had used countless long and humiliating lives to obtain collapsed. He watched as the pitiful few belongings in those slums were crushed to pieces by the mecha's tracks. He watched as the resistance members and innocent civilians who were dragged into the streets in rows were taken away like livestock. There were even more people who were directly escorted to the streets and shot to death. Blood flowed like water. No one could be in a good mood, even though he was a Federation officer. Logically speaking, he should immediately begin to consider how much strength the resistance group would have left after this round of cleansing. How much movement they would have in other star systems, especially the border star systems, how much benefit they could bring to the federal forces, and whether or not there was a need to continue this cooperation. However, the scene before his eyes made it impossible for him to consider these things. In particular, the courtyard beside the small pond, which was cleaner and more refreshing than the surrounding buildings, made him very worried. He had lived in that warm courtyard for more than half a year. What would happen to Aunts Susan and Paul naturally made him feel uneasy. Fortunately, the courtyard had been strangely quiet for the past few days, which made him feel a little relieved. "Get ready to go," Chi Dabing poked his head out of the side room and said with a tired expression. Sulu nodded and took one last look at the small courtyard. He carefully crushed the cigarette on the railing, quickly checked the weapons on his body, and turned to leave. He had promised Aunt Susan that he would tell her when he left, but now it seemed that this had become an extravagant hope. Wai Chaosher was also about to leave. The battle at the front line was very fierce. She should have set off on the battleship to provide support as early as 10 days ago. Now, hundreds of new Wolf Fang mechs were already on the way, but as the highest commander and the strongest combat force, she was still forced to stay on Tianjing. The strong desire to annihilate the underground resistance group and kill Su Lu could not make her stay indefinitely. Before leaving, to the surprise of all the subordinate officers, she did not enter the palace to bid farewell to His Majesty. Instead, under the protection of more than 10 mechs, she came to the chaotic slums and came to a quiet courtyard. Aunt Susan looked at the courtyard full of armed soldiers with cold expressions with a pale face. She did not dare to speak as loudly as she usually did. Instead, she nervously grabbed her son's hand and pulled him behind her. In these days, she, who was cheerful and even a little rough, had become a little nervous after hearing the cries and gunshots outside the courtyard. She did not know why these cold-blooded soldiers rushed into her small courtyard. Vaguely, she wondered if these soldiers were looking for the poor black-haired aristocrat. Thinking of this, the hand holding her son tightly became cold and began to tremble. A young imperial officer with a cold aura walked in under the protection of many people. He raised his head and glanced at this ordinary courtyard. His brows furrowed slightly. He took off his military cap and rubbed his slightly curly black hair. Aunt Susan took a few deep breaths, bravely held her son's hand, and came to the front of the imperial officer. She half-squatted in standard aristocratic etiquette and said, "It's a great honor." An officer next to her whispered, "This is Her Royal Highness the Princess." Hearing this name, Aunt Susan and Paul, who had been staring at the soldiers angrily, were stunned at the same time. They were frozen in place for a long time. When they were about to kneel down in panic, Wei Chaoshi narrowed her eyes and waved her finger to stop their movements. She said calmly, "No need." In the next 10 minutes, Her Royal Highness, accompanied by Aunt Susan, toured the small courtyard. She looked at the famous video and audio equipment in the black market with interest. During the whole process, she never asked a word about Su Lu. Before leaving, Wei Chaoshi took out an old diary from the pocket of her military jacket. After a moment of silence, she looked at the stiff Aunt Susan and asked, "Do you have a brother who joined the expeditionary army?" "His name is Arthur." Chapter 649. It was a rough tan calfskin jacket, and the inner page was made of plant fiber paper. It was a diary. This diary followed the once young, proud, determined, and gentle imperial officer through a 7-year interstellar journey. From the Empire to a planet called 5460 in the western border of the Federation. After a massacre order, it was silently attached to the left side of the young officer's chest, and began to sleep in a pit of thousands of people under the ice and snow. Later, there was an equally young, proud, determined, and gentle Federation officer who fled from the Eastwood region of the Federation to the capital ring. He followed the army to this planet called 5460. Before Luling arrived, he accidentally fell into this cold and cruel pit of thousands of people. He found this diary on the chest of the imperial officer, which was as hard as steel. The diary began another journey. It followed the Federation officer to more distant places until he finally returned home. The calfskin that was wrapped around the diary was seriously damaged. It seemed that it would turn into rotten scraps with the slightest force. The plant fiber paper inside had even begun to fall off. It was very different from the appearance when the high-spirited officer of the Imperium first held it in his hands. But Aunt Susan still recognized it at a glance. This was because she bought it herself many years ago. She was also the one who personally handed it to her brother. She sold the last piece of jewelry left by her mother, but she could only afford a rough calfskin one. She couldn't afford a refined calfskin one. The difference of one word was Aunt Susan's regret for many years later. Sometimes she even thought that if she had bought a good diary for her brother, he might not have been shot for violating military discipline. This was a sad and illogical thought. However, for an isolated and helpless sinful lady who struggled to survive in the slums, she could only blame herself in this way and miss her family. Aunt Susan took the old diary with trembling hands. She couldn't help but cover her face with her right hand. Her calloused fingers rubbed hard on her chubby and weather-beaten cheeks, but she couldn't stop the tears from flowing out of her fingers. For many years, the pain and torment of life could not make this lady, who was forced to be cheerful, optimistic, and even irritable, shed a single tear. But today, when she saw the relics left behind by her dead brother, the countless days of grievance and pain seemed to have found a channel to vent, and she cried loudly. Holding the diary in her left hand, she covered her face with her right hand and cried bitterly. At this moment, Susan felt as if she saw her brother with the warmest smile standing in front of her again. Paul looked at his crying mother in shock, holding her weak elbow. He rarely saw such a sad side of his mother. He didn't know what the diary represented. His subconscious impulse to protect his mother made him want to question Huai Chaoshe in front of him. However, thinking of the noble identity of the other party, he didn't dare to say anything in the end. The chubby woman crying in the clean little courtyard made the expressions of the surrounding imperial officers become a bit strange. As the direct subordinates of His Highness, they knew that the diary His Highness was holding probably belonged to a colleague who had sacrificed himself, but they didn't know the contents of the diary. For a moment, a kind of desolate and sorrowful feeling rose in the courtyard. A few of the officers quietly took off their military hats. Huai Chaoshe looked at the woman crying like a child in front of her, and her eyes gradually narrowed. Su Lu got the diary and brought it back to the Empire. This chubby woman who looked unusually mediocre happened to be Arthur's sister, and for some reason, she was willing to take great risks and hide him in the small courtyard for nearly a year. She had read the diary carefully before. From Officer Arthur's records, she felt something that she had never felt before. Now, she felt more and more that something was destined. Could it be that something was destined in the unseen world? How did this story with a very small probability happen? Or did the creator think that this pair of brother and sister who were separated by life and death, separated by the vast universe, had some kind of virtue that should be cherished, so he used Su Li's hand to show a little mercy? Huai Chaoshe had no mercy. In her opinion, things like virtue should only be appreciated when the world allowed it to be possessed. Now that the flames of war were burning in the universe, this relatively nihilistic existence must go away. The Imperial forces had carried out many massacres of civilians and technicians in the Federation West Woods. When reading the military report afterward, Huai Chaoshe thought that this action made no sense, but she also strongly disagreed with the stupid behavior of Officer Arthur who violated the orders of his superiors. "Your name is Paul." Huai Chaoshe was silent for a moment, and suddenly looked at the young boy who was at a loss and said, "According to your school's files, you are recently participating in military training." Paul glanced nervously at his mother who was still crying, swallowed his saliva to moisten his throat, and replied in a low voice, "Yes." He didn't know why Her Royal Highness, who was like a god in the hearts of the imperial people, came to his home. He was even more shocked that Her Royal Highness seemed to know who he was and what he had done. "Your military training ends here." Huai Chaoshe glanced at him, turned around, and left. Paul had no good feelings for the imperial armies that were wantonly abusing the slums, but his heart was full of enthusiasm to resist the Federation invaders. In the eyes of a civilian student like him, joining the imperial armies was also a precious right. Hearing Her Royal Highness's words, he was shocked and his blood surged. He protested loudly, "Why?" Huai Chaoshe put her hands behind her back and gently held them on her waist. She ignored the boy's protest and directly ordered the subordinate beside her, "Remember his number, no one is allowed to let him go to the front line." "Who is the person who hung you on the tree? Is he back?" "I don't know, because you told me last time that he was dead, so I wasn't mentally prepared at all." Putting anesthetic in the tea bowl, this kind of despicable but extraordinarily useful means is indeed very much like what Nasri is used to do. According to the information sent back from the Federation, he should be dead. The Federation's robot head should hate him no less than me. Although he has absurdly escaped the robot head's pursuit many times, I always thought that miracles can't be repeated again and again. On the top floor of the Zhaixing Hall, the low buzzing of the maglev equipment faintly came from below. The surrounding ultraviolet filtering gauze fluttered with the wind. Emperor Huai Fu-chai slowly turned around and looked at the beautiful middle-aged man standing outside the screen. He frowned in disgust. He always felt that the thin white robe on this person was like a white gauze curtain hanging behind him. As for the pair of long naked legs that were like a woman's, it made him feel sick for decades. From the standpoint of the empire, I don't think you should have any hatred for Nasri at all. If it wasn't for him single-handedly causing that huge explosion back then, perhaps Li Pifu would have led the federal forces to blow up your palace. How can the confrontation between the two largest war machines in the universe be changed by one person and an explosion? The emperor's tone was stern and had a hint of mockery. You people always habitually want to worship a certain person. Teacher is dead, and you are too useless. Great Master Fan Manor, do you feel that you can't even straighten your back, so you think that by placing teacher as a student in the temple, you can continue to maintain the mysterious and inviolable feeling of your family? Student Emperor, our family has never needed to work hard to maintain our status. If you are sending out your strong voice to the 1,000-year-old blood oath, I will be very happy to see the birth of a piece of history. At the same time, I want to see with my own eyes how the Hibiscus dynasty is destroyed. The mockery in the great teacher's words was no less than this man with the most power in the universe. It was unknown what kind of trump card his family had that could make him so relaxed and crazy when facing the emperor of the empire. If there is another incident like this. The emperor narrowed his eyes slightly and looked at him calmly. He said, I will forget what a blood oath is. At least I can kill you first. As for how many trump cards your Hua family has left behind, and whether this dynasty can continue, when that time comes, perhaps I won't care anymore. The great teacher looked at the emperor's narrowed eyes and knew that the other party really had the intention to kill. However, his expression was still so casual and charming. With a snap, he lit the cigarette between his lips for a long time. He shrugged and said, It seems that you are really pessimistic about the future of the empire. No, I just loathe the existence of swindlers like you. This loathing sometimes even surpasses the greatest wish of my life. The emperor stared at him with loathing. His gaze then fell on an old thorn covered in black blood stains. The great teacher was slightly stunned. Then, he bowed and saluted. Without waiting for the emperor's permission, he started walking toward the entrance of the maglev ship. Where are you going? The emperor turned around and held on to the railing. He looked at the vast sky outside. I am going to find that spaceship and see if there is a chance to sneak into the Federation. The great teacher did not stop walking. He said indifferently, if I can get in, perhaps I can find that destroyed name list. The emperor's expression, which was like a 10,000-year-old glacier, loosened slightly at this moment. The hero's plan, which had lasted for several decades, had now been seen through by the Federation. However, if the destroyed name list could be found, it might still be alive. In the end, you are still a citizen of the Empire. The Emperor looked at the sky and smiled slightly. He could not see any aircraft in his line of sight. However, outside the atmosphere, in the space bases around Tianjing planet, in dozens of star systems controlled by the Empire, countless heavy alloy war machines were nervously being loaded. Densely packed battleships of the Empire floated silently and sternly in space, ready to head to the front lines at any moment. The war had already begun, so let it continue with vigor. Chapter 650. It was raining heavily. Water droplets the size of pebbles gushed out from the black clouds and hit everything between heaven and earth. They bombarded the yellow sand on the Jiama coast with countless deep and shallow holes that looked extremely miserable. The mist was so thick that it covered the usually gentle and beautiful appearance of the peaceful bay. This was the most famous summer resort of the royal family in the southern hemisphere of Tianjing planet. In this stormy early summer day, the soldiers and staff were forced to stay indoors. As a result, they did not notice that in the valley behind the Green Mountain to the north of the bay, there was an intense battle taking place. The violent and gloomy rainstorm masked the sudden and crisp sounds of gunfire. The dazzling gunfire was also not so clear. Only the figures that fell from time to time and the blood that was washed away by the rain proved the cruelty of the battle. A whistling bullet brushed past him, but Su Li's eyelashes did not tremble at all. He held the gun with both hands and stood steadily in the wind and rain. He pulled the trigger quickly and rhythmically. Every bullet shot out from the barrel and passed through the rain, hitting a soldier of the Empire. The brim of the hat could not block the pouring rain. The rain quickly flowed down his cheeks and caused some interference to his vision, causing him to squint his eyes. However, it did not seem to affect the accuracy of his shooting. He stood calmly in the wind and rain like this, pulling the trigger and letting the hot and refined bullet shells jump out, fly above his wrist, and fall beside his feet. In a short 7 seconds, he fired more than 10 shots. Among the Empire soldiers on the road who were using the military vehicles as cover, 5 of them fell under his gun. The cracked bulletproof glass and the car panels that were shot with sparks could protect the vital parts of the Empire soldiers, but there was no way to protect their exposed feet or hands. The battle in the wind and rain started suddenly and ended exceptionally quickly. After dozens of seconds, the Empire soldiers who were ambushed were completely annihilated. The 3 logistics military vehicles that drove out of the Royal Summer Resort were silent. They stopped helplessly on the road. The soldiers of the resistance organization who were lying in ambush around the valley rushed to the road in their old military uniforms without epaulets. Some of them began to clean up the battlefield, while others surrounded Su Lu and boarded the 3 military vehicles. In the short and hurried battle, resistance fighters closed their eyes forever. Su Lu sat in the front passenger seat and used his sleeves to wipe off the rainwater on his face. He didn't reveal any emotions. In order to send him away from Tianjin planet and leave the capital city, countless members of the resistance organization had sacrificed their lives for this. Having seen so much didn't mean that he was numb. He just kept this heavy feeling in the deepest part of his heart. Colonel Su Lu, if everyone in the Federal Army has such good marksmanship like yours, I think, we really won't be able to fight this war. The gang leader, Mr. Muen, who met with the crowd in the suburbs of the capital city, looked at the wet hair of the young people of the Federation in the front row and thought of the awe-inspiring shooting scene in the rain. He couldn't help but sigh emotionally. Su Lu lowered his head and seriously checked the guns and ammunition in his hands. He replied, "At least, we're allies now. You don't have to worry about this, right?" Muen shrugged and didn't say anything else. He looked at the fur coat on his body that had been drenched beyond recognition by the rain with a slight headache and cursed in a low voice. Qi Dabing, who had been silent all this while, finished checking the guns and lit a cigarette. After hesitating for a moment, he gave 2 cigarettes to Su Lu in front and Muen beside him. Muen's subordinates were all skilled technicians in the repair shop. In a short time, they cleaned up the exterior of the 3 military vehicles until they were close to perfect. Thus, the 3 military vehicles that were forced to stop started moving again. The violent wind and rain hit the windshield. The people in the vehicles had to speak louder. Perhaps it was because the physical and psychological toll of running for their lives had been too great. Everyone felt a little tired and didn't want to fight against the angry roars of nature, so no one spoke again. The entire journey was silent. Only the pungent smoke filled the interior of the vehicle. Occasionally, it would drift out through the gaps between the windows, but it was instantly swept away by the violent wind and rain outside, leaving no trace behind. How could they leave Tianjin planet? Su Lu didn't know about the plans of the Empire's underground resistance organization. As a member of the Federation, he maintained his silence the entire way and followed the soldiers as they made their way south. In the process of escaping, he was surprised to find that even though the Empire's royal family had brutally suppressed them, the resistance organization still maintained a strong presence on this planet. No matter which city they went to, which mountain they went to, they would always see some ragged guerrillas coming to their aid. Sometimes, they would suddenly find the owner of a coffee shop extending his warm hands. Furthermore, there was one thing that he couldn't understand. The imperial armies, who should have been crazily chasing after them, didn't have a grasp of their whereabouts. In the middle of the night, 3 military vehicles drove into a heavily guarded logistics base. Sulu lowered the brim of his hat and looked at Chi Dabing's cold face as he interacted with the soldiers stationed there. Looking at the electronic customs codes that he had snatched, his eyebrows furrowed slightly. Under the accompaniment of the night rain, the group silently walked into the underground armory south of the logistics base. A few stern-looking Empire officers walked straight toward them and shook hands with Chi Dabing and Muen. They lowered their hands and said a few words about the launch in the early hours of the morning. At this moment, Sulu more or less understood the resistance organization's plan. He subconsciously raised his head to look at the sky. His gaze passed through the thick layer of cement and seemed to see a logistics spaceship. At this moment, it was already mounted on a rocket, waiting to be launched amidst the wind and rain. In order to send you away, many people in the slums of the capital have already died. You saw with your own eyes how many of us have died along the way. What you didn't see was that in order to cover our true destination, there have been uprisings and riots in all the cities and counties in the capital over the past few days. Hearing Chi Dabing's cold and extremely pressurizing words, Sulu finally understood the answer that had puzzled him for a long time. In order to attract the attention of the Empire's military and the Royal Intelligence Bureau and cover their departure from Tianjing Planet, the resistance organization had chosen the most inopportune time to spread the flames of rebellion everywhere. Having just suffered a cruel blow, what the resistance organization needed the most now was to recuperate and go underground. However, in order to send Sulu away, they had made the opposite choice. Even the stupidest person could imagine how heavy a price the resistance organization would have to pay for this. Sulu was silent. He subconsciously took out a cigarette from the pocket of his military jacket, only to realize that the cigarette inside had long been soaked in the rain. Chi Dabing passed him a cigarette, took out a lighter, but didn't light it immediately. He said in a low voice, "I don't really understand the true relationship between you and my teacher, and I don't really believe in the moral integrity of the people of the Federation. However, since Leader Voss has chosen you, then we will carry on with this matter. Remember." This man from the Empire, who was most likely to become the next leader of the resistance organization, looked into Su Li's eyes and lit the flame with a snap. He said seriously, "Thousands of people have died because of you, and in the future, a very simple action from you could possibly make their deaths worthless. If that day really comes, we won't be able to make you compensate us, but you must remember that those thousands of wronged souls will always be floating behind your head." Sulu took a deep puff of the cigarette. When he took the cigarette out, the filter tip stuck to the corner of his lips, causing him to frown slightly in pain. After a moment of silence, he gently pursed his lips. He didn't make any verbal promises and only nodded slightly. "Actually, after observing you along the way, I feel that you are still trustworthy." Chi Dabing seemed to be very satisfied with Su Li's performance. After pausing for a moment, he took out a chip and handed it to Sulu. "This is a gift from Mr. to the people of the Federation." "What is it?" Sulu asked. "It should be a piece of information related to the people of the Federation," Chi Dabing said. Chi Dabing said, "Sir said that you might use it or throw it away, but it has nothing to do with us." Sulu was silent for a moment and suddenly thought of something. He looked at Chi Dabing and said, "There's something that I need your help with. The people of the Federation definitely think that I've died a long time ago. I've been worried that some messy things will happen because of this. Therefore, I hope that you can use your own channels to inform the troops over there that I'm still alive." "What messy things?" Chi Dabing said mockingly. "Widows remarrying because of a misunderstanding? I'm not married yet." Sulu smiled bitterly and replied, "But if those ladies think that I'm dead and randomly remarry, it'll really make me feel so depressed that I'll vomit blood." Chi Dabing was stunned for a moment. Then, the two of them looked at each other and couldn't help but laugh. Their laughter reverberated in the spacious underground armory like a rolling snowball, becoming louder and louder, completely covering up the faint sounds of the wind and rain. A few hours later, in the darkness of dawn, accompanied by the deafening sound of engines, a military transport spaceship that was urgently in need of military equipment at the front lines rode on a rocket and left a nameless logistics and equipment base on Tianjin, flying toward the dark universe. The high-temperature flames at the bottom of the engine sizzled as they burned the rain that filled the sky. A stretch of slightly hot white steam rose from the launch base. Amidst the quiet green hills, Qi Dabing looked at the eye-catching ray of light in the night sky and thought of the young man from the Federation. After a long silence, he shook his head and coughed a few times. Then, he led the resistance fighters under him and walked silently into the wind and rain, into the darkness. At this moment, a large Empire transport spaceship had already left the gravitational control of the local star system and passed through two small warp holes, advancing toward the boundless borders of the universe. Invisible particles hit the porthole of the transport spaceship, giving off a strange blood-red glow. It made White Saosher's ordinary face on the porthole appear especially indifferent. Chapter 651. Just now, I did a little test and found that I was trapped in the fourth level, a world where there is still endless work to be done while jumping through time and space. So I cried. The next chapter will be around 3:00. The universe is a big stage, on which countless great, humble, heroic, cowardly, beautiful and ugly characters take turns to appear, affectionately acting, under the illumination of those grotesque lights, acting out scenes of tragicomedy or numbing soap operas of life. But from another perspective, the universe was actually just a very small stage. There were not many big shots who were qualified to appear on it and stand under the spotlight for hundreds of millions of ordinary people to see. In the autumn of the 71st year of the Federation's constitutional calendar, in the West Woods border that had just been extinguished for less than a year, accompanied by loud and clear military songs, an overwhelming number of battleships and imposing groups of mechas, crossed two giant space tunnels filled with dangerous turbulence and began to burn among the stars within the Empire's territory. On such a historical drama stage filled with the smell of iron and blood, the most eye-catching characters were undoubtedly the men who were full of personal heroism on the battlefield. But in fact, in the hearts of many people, the main character they cared about the most was actually a woman, the Empire's princess who had not appeared for a long time. Correspondingly, the most eye-catching character on the stage on the Federation's side should have been Sulu, the civilian hero who had an amazing resume and background and was deeply loved by the Federation's president and the people. But what broke the hearts of the Federation's people was that this war hero with a pair of charming small eyes had fallen in the universe long before the war began because of the suffocating pursuit of revenge. At this time, both the Empire and the Federation seemed to have forgotten a person. After Su Li's death, that person should have carried the banner of the federal forces and jumped onto the stage with his usual violent attitude, standing in the whistling wind and facing the princess. But for some reason, on the battlefield of the stars where the flames of war spread, there had been no news of him for a long time. In the rich autumn, the charter square of the capital special zone was covered with golden leaves. The diligent self-cleaning vehicles were tactful and did not immediately clean it up. A gathering was being held on the square. Tens of thousands of Federation citizens gently stepped on the withered leaves with smiles on their faces and gathered here to listen to President Pabre's speech on the stage. As the news of the federal forces' continuous victories spread back to the capital ring, the reputation of this dark-faced politician rose day by day. He, who already had a very high prestige in the hearts of the people, had now become a kind of symbol of the Federation. With his extremely high political wisdom and fearlessness, he forcefully pushed the strategy of attacking the Empire's mainland despite the opposition of the aristocratic families, and to a certain extent, he had obtained the loyalty of all the Federation's troops. It was said that on the other side of the space tunnel, on the frontline planet, there were a few brave field units. Brave and battles of the Federations have begun to put the digital image of President Pabre, President Li's God's God of Wars, Li, God of the Federations, S. On the giant 3D light beam on the west side of the square, the news channel's report on the front line was rolling. Early this morning, the vanguard troops, with the expansion of the Iron 7th Division and the new 17th Division as the main force, successfully forced the main administrative planet of the Empire's Yellow Disaster System to begin the Federal Forces' military plan to occupy the second border galaxy of the Empire. The gathering of the people that was being broadcasted live to the entire Federation today was to celebrate this exhilarating victory. Because of Mr. President's calm and charismatic speech on the podium, the somewhat cold late autumn became warm and even lively. People waved their arms, shouted the slogan, "Long live the Federal Army," and hugged the strangers they did not know in excitement. In this speech, people forgot all the unpleasant things in their lives. The difficulties of their bosses, the price of the unpalatable protein meat, the inexplicable breakup, and the departure of their friends were no longer important. As for the people who had passed away, such as Commander Zhong, Sulu, and the cases that still had no clear results, they had long disappeared in the ocean of joy. The seed of the Empire, who led to the ambush of the warships in the West Woods and the deaths of Commander Zhong and his wife, had committed suicide for fear of punishment. Secretary Jiao, who stole the electronic seal of the Department of Defense and deceived the Bureau of Proclamation into suspending the investigation, had also committed suicide for fear of punishment. The investigation of the case could not go any further. Also, the rare good political situation did not allow the investigation to go any further. The Bureau of Proclamation, which had been under great pressure in the case of Commander Zhong's assassination, finally returned to its usual cold and arrogant appearance. The assistant to Director Cui Zhedong, who had been under investigation for half a year, was reinstated. Perhaps in the near future, he would take over the position of director of the Bureau of Proclamation. The old director Tai slowly rubbed the golf club in his hand and looked tiredly at the last yellow leaf hanging on the branches outside the window. He was over 90 years old and was ready to bow his head and admit defeat to the natural law of life. However, the things that had happened in the past few years made him have a trace of doubt about his decision back then. Was it appropriate for the Bureau of Proclamation to be handed over to Cui Zhedong? Old Director Tai sighed silently in his heart. He thought of the secret conversation in the Linyuan yesterday. After hearing his invitation, the broken door that he thought the most highly of, after silently thinking for half an hour, still expressed a firm refusal. In the old man's opinion, Lin Banshan was the best candidate for the position of director of the Bureau of Proclamation. However, it was indeed difficult to ask a person who didn't even want to be the heir of the 7 major families, who betrayed his family when he was young, who only wanted to wander and fight among the stars, and who was accompanied by the central computer that only knew how to think mechanically. Just like the Bureau of Proclamation's metabolism, the Federation without Su Lu was no different from the Federation in the past few years. Some things happened. Some people died, some newborns were born. Some people fell in love, some people got married, and naturally, some people fell out of love, and some people got divorced. Li Pifu, the god of war, was still fishing by Lake Feicheng. He only showed his old and frightening face at the ceremony where the federal forces vowed to attack the empire. His only son, Li Jiedu, was still gentle and harmless as the president of the First Military Academy. General Miles was still completing the last few years of his term as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He was very eager for the federal forces to bring back the best news before his old teacher left and before he grew old. On the other side of the space tunnel, the federal forces were like a burning fire as they swiftly and violently took down the outermost administrative star system of the Empire. They obtained a rare forward base for the war. On the glorious battlefield, Du Shaoqing, the commander of the Iron 7th Division with the rank of Major General, was still as fierce as ever. Near the Iron 7th Division's iron flow, the news reporters and soldiers could always see traces of the new 17th Division. These 2 most famous and bravest units of the Federation were like in a race, chasing each other and fighting on the front line of danger. Today's victory that made the entire Federation rejoice was achieved by these 2 units. Unlike the bustling Charter Square, the West Mountain compound, where the headquarters of the federal military was located, was particularly quiet. The falling leaves that were rustling on the streets and the gate where no military vehicles could be seen for an hour even gave people a feeling of depression. All the attention of the military was on the front line. The senior officers of the Ministry of National Defense and the staff officers of the various military regions were either calculating in the command hall, or cursing in the base to force the General Assembly base to speed up the production pace, or pulling their hair in the Shell Industrial Park of the port city. Instead, the West Mountain compound became quiet. In the depths of the quiet compound, there was a heavily guarded small building. In the past 6 months, medical personnel wearing white work clothes came in and out from time to time. The professors and experts of the medical department of the Capital University and the First People's Hospital used to hold meetings and debate all night long. However, today, even the small building became quiet. Zhou Yu, who had a little red flower in her hair, wore a small black windbreaker today. When the autumn wind blew across her cheeks and body, the beautiful red flower petals trembled slightly. The corner of the windbreaker rolled up, revealing the bright red color inside. The iron gate of the small building slowly opened, and a young man wearing a colonel's uniform walked out. His military posture was standard, and his posture was extremely straight. It was as if the electric current stimulation and inhuman pain of the past 6 months did not happen to him. That childishness still existed in the past, but it was exceptionally violent. Now, it seemed to have calmed down a lot. Although his eyes were still filled with disdain for the heavens, the earth, and this world, as well as violence that could burst out at any time, that childishness had long since disappeared. Yes, he was now a young man. Zhou Yu walked up and gently hugged him at the bottom of the stone steps. She furrowed her brows and looked at him with strong disapproval. "You really are a lunatic." Li Feng did not say anything. Instead, he smiled happily. He looked at the autumn trees in the courtyard and took in a breath of the slightly cold autumn wind. He felt the smell that he had not felt for a long time and said, "I like this feeling of strength." When the federal forces were fighting a bloody battle on the front lines, when Huai Chaoshi and Su Lu were fighting fiercely on the Empire's Tianjing planet, Li Feng, who had once carried the unlimited hope of the federal military in his early years and who had become famous as a lunatic at a young age, unexpectedly did not appear on the battlefield. "You are already strong enough. Why do you still need to use such a cruel training method?" Zhou Yu looked at him coldly and said, "Although the relevant details are strictly confidential, these few times when I came to deliver things to you, I often heard your blood-curdling screams." "Why is that?" Thinking of that shocking phone call she had eavesdropped on in her father's study, Zhou Yu suddenly felt a throbbing pain between her brows. She looked at him full of pity and said, "Do you know that you may only live for 70 years? Li Feng's cheeks were clearly much thinner than before. After hearing Zhou Yu's question, he lowered his head in silence. Thinking of the electric shocks he had endured over the past half a year and the unbearable pain, he raised his head and said seriously, "Yuzi, you should know that the Empire's princess is much older than me." Zhou Yu looked at him in confusion, not knowing why he had suddenly brought this up. Although many years ago, people seemed to be used to comparing the Federation's Mad Man Li with the Empire's princess, she passed rank 6 at the age of 16. She is a genius. Madman Li's eyebrows were like knives, and he said with a rare serious and cold voice, "I am also a genius. My speed is about the same as hers. But she is older than me, so she is stronger than me." This was a conclusion that appeared overly simple, but coming from Madman Li's mouth, it gave people a feeling that they had no choice but to believe it. If both sides were geniuses, then the difference in strength between them might be a simple matter of age. Madman Li raised his head to look at the sky and continued, "In the past, my sense of crisis was not that serious because the Federation still has Su Lu. Chapter 652. Because Su Lu is dead, I have to be stronger than that princess. On the battlefield, Who knows if you can live past tomorrow? What is there to be dissatisfied with if you can live to 70 years old? Do you want to be like those old lecherous generals in the general hospital who have no teeth and can only drink porridge and desperately hold on to a nurse's hand to survive? Disgusting. So don't ask if it's worth it, because it's definitely worth it. Very good. The above words were with Madman Li's unique simple and direct violent logic. It was sonorous and powerful, and when it fell on the ground full of yellow leaves, it could smash the withered leaves into pieces. Suddenly, he smiled shyly, gently patted Zhou Yu's shoulder, and said, I'm going back to Feiqing City tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow to the army. Tonight, do you want to have dinner together? Zhou Yu rubbed her painful shoulder, frowned and looked at him, and said, Of course, dinner is not a problem, but don't expect anything else. The autumn wind blew, and the yellow leaves moved. There was a long silence outside the small building. Li Feng clenched his fist, and asked with a bitterness that was impossible when he was young, why? He has been dead for a year. Zhou Yu didn't explain anything, and just smiled. Then she stood on tiptoe, raised her arm, and gently patted Li Feng's shoulder. This action was very gentle, so gentle that the little red flower on her temples didn't tremble, but Li Feng felt that her hand was stronger than his own. In the military vehicle that had been waiting on the other side of the yellow leaves, Shi Qinghai looked at this scene and faintly blinked his beautiful eyes. The little boy next to him rolled his eyes, wondering why this annoying guy often came to see him. The top floor of the most luxurious Wenhua Hotel in Hong Kong was designed as a revolving restaurant. This decent enough place naturally became the best choice for rich people to socialize. At the same time, many well-off families would hold very important matchmaking activities in this restaurant. Sorry, I'm late. Shang Qiu's cheeks were slightly red, and her eyebrows were slightly sweaty. She hurriedly walked to the table next to the window and politely apologized to the mother and son sitting across the table. Because the engineering department was doing the final assembly verification of the MXT turbocharger design, she was much later than the agreed time. She directly returned to the city from the industrial park and didn't even have time to change into the more ladylike dress that she prepared in advance. 4 seasons had quietly passed, but this beautiful and intelligent female engineer still looked the same as before. Perhaps it was because her life and way of thinking were quite simple and pure, time did not leave any traces on this beautiful face. Especially today, she was wearing a somewhat loose short-sleeved shirt and carelessly matched dark blue overalls, and the eye-catching oil stains on them made her look like a female apprentice who had just entered the repair shop. She was very cute. The man in his 20s sitting across the table clearly thought so. A look of surprise flashed across his slightly wooden face. His gaze swept past Shang Qiu's proud chest and was immediately shocked to the point of lowering his head awkwardly. He probably never thought that one of the most famous engineers in the Federation would actually have such a good-looking appearance. But for the lady next to the man, she had booked the entire revolving restaurant and suppressed her temper while waiting for so long, only to see her blind date wearing such clothes. Obviously, she felt disrespected, so before Shang Qiu could explain anything, the lady began to speak in a cold and mocking tone. If it wasn't for the fact that this blind date was arranged by Mr. President Nutshell, who couldn't be offended, perhaps this lady would have already left. Shang Qiu quietly listened to the sarcastic words of the lady sitting across the table, but her heart was very calm. For her, a blind date was somewhat inexplicable. It was so inexplicable that her ears seemed to be blocked by a lot of silencers. For her, her biggest regret now was facing delicious food and tempting red wine. She had been thirsty all night and had to control her urge to eat in order to maintain her image. She had to give face to Mr. CEO. Shang Qiu sat in the chair tiredly and looked at the lady sitting across the table. Her lips kept moving, but the phone call from Mr. CEO a few days ago echoed in her ears. Yes, that guy is dead, but life has to go on. Just as the situation became more and more awkward, and Shang Qiu might pounce on the food in the next moment and the lady screamed and started to fight, the young man who had been silent all this time finally spoke. He asked his mother to give the two of them some time alone. The lady did not expect that her son, who had never disobeyed her in his life, would show a tough side for the first time at this moment. After a while, her face turned pale and she angrily walked out of the restaurant with her expensive bag. This unforeseen event made Shang Qiu's clean eyes flash with a trace of surprise. She looked at the uneasy and even a little shy guy in front of her and thought that the so-called young talent introduced by Mr. CEO didn't seem to have a bad character. I'm on a blind date because of the company's request. Shang Qiu relaxed, her tired shoulders drooped, and leaned back in the chair, showing the curves of her body more obvious. For Shang Qiu, the chief technical director, who was likely to become an independent technical director in the future, the board of directors and the logistics department of Nutshell Company paid enough attention and care to her. And Mr. CEO, who vaguely guessed the little relationship between her and Su Lu, spared no effort to promote Shang Qiu's marriage plan. I understand. The young man across the table said in a trembling voice, but I really want to ask you to try dating me. Shang Qiu obviously didn't have the self-awareness of a child's face and a sexy body. She looked at him curiously, scratched her head like a boy, and suddenly said, "No dating, I only want to get married." Okay. The young man's answer was very firm. I have to remind you that I'm not very interested in sex. If I get married, I won't take on the duties of a wife. Shang Qiu's eyes narrowed slightly, looking out of the window at the autumn wind passing through the streets of Harbor City. Suddenly, she thought of the winter snow on the distant West Woods planet and the warm, erotic, but timid big hands. The young man looked at her puzzledly, and asked a little numbly and uneasily, "Please forgive my rudeness, but if that's the case, why do you want to get married?" "You know, I'm working in the Nutshell engineering department. Facing machines and those nerds who are more feminine than women every day, it's really a little boring. Moreover, in the next year, there probably won't be any challenging work, so my time will be more leisurely." Shang Qiu explained seriously, "So I want to have a child." Her blind date obviously couldn't immediately adapt to Shang Qiu's logic. He scratched his head for a long time and asked, "You also want to have a child?" "Nonsense. Whether it's from a physical or psychological point of view, I'm a woman." The young man secretly glanced at her round and perky breasts with a hint of guilt, thinking that anyone could see them. Suddenly, he thought of a problem, and grinned happily, revealing his white teeth, and said, "If you want to have a child, you have to have sex, at least, once." Shang Qiu suddenly felt that her eyes were a little dazzled by the sincere and happy smile of the man across the table and his white teeth. She subconsciously replied, "I'm going to use a test tube." Late at night, Parliament Hill was quiet. Only the office on the first floor by the garden was still lit. The light in the night was weak but firm, as if it would stay on forever. At this time, the distinguished members of Parliament were attending a banquet at the Flowing Wind Slope Club. Tonight's banquet was held to celebrate the great victory on planet Huang-E, 23 days after the Iron 7th Division and the new 17th Division forcefully landed on the main administrative planet of the Huang-E galaxy. The Federal forces finally succeeded in eliminating all of the Empire's main forces on this administrative planet and gained full control. As an official of Green Dragon Mountain stationed in the capital, Zhang Xiaoming naturally received an invitation, but she didn't go. Instead, she stayed in her office and dealt with the seemingly endless work. Following the start of the war on the Empire's mainland, the role of the anti-government forces of Green Dragon Mountain gradually faded. Although President Pabre very respectfully continued to implement the reconciliation agreement of the past, the feeling of being gradually swallowed up by silence or forgotten by the people made the Committee on S2 very uneasy. She, who had already taken over the 4 departments, naturally had to put in more effort and time to appease the uneasiness of the committee members. Hai Qingzhou silently stood under the stone steps of Parliament Hill, looking at the brightly lit office like a statue. Bitterness filled his mouth. Ever since he was in Yue University, he had been bitterly pursuing this naked girl. After so many years, his father had successfully become a member of the Federation and entered the building in front of him, but he still couldn't find a way to enter the girl's heart. On both sides of the dusty street were buildings riddled with holes. From time to time, chunks of cement would fall and hit the top of the charred cars, making a muffled bang. Muffled sounds of gunfire could be heard from afar. The strangely shaped red moon above seemed to have been dyed red by the blood of the past few days. This was a street in the southern district of Fagar City, the administrative main planet of the Huang-E galaxy. After the huge explosion from the last military base of the Empire 2 days ago, there was no longer any organized resistance on this planet at the edge of the Empire. The angry, sorrowful, and frightened Empire citizens trembled and curled up in their own homes. Occasionally, a brave boy would risk the danger of being shot and spit a few times at the Federation forces on the street. 7 tall black MX mechas slowly walked on both sides of the street, their cold shadows covering the end of the street. The rumbling heavy multi-axle transport vehicles cautiously moved in the shadows. Bai Yulan, covered in dust, sat in an armored vehicle, holding an H-model long sniper rifle in her arms, looking ahead with an expressionless face. At this time, a tattered civilian Empire vehicle turned the corner and suddenly discovered their mixed Federation mecha squad. The Empire driver, who was trying to escape out of the city, couldn't hold the steering wheel properly due to nervousness and fear, driving in this direction crookedly. Seeing this scene, Bai Yulan subconsciously used her finger to lightly flick in front of her forehead, but she touched nothing. Only then did she remember that when Group 7 was performing the moon sacrifice for that guy, she didn't know what went wrong and cut off all the hair floating in front of her forehead. Chapter 653. Bai Yulan's fingers didn't touch the hair in front of his forehead. He paused for a moment, then immediately turned his attention back to the vehicle that was zooming over with a blank expression. The mixed mecha squad he was leading was escorting the multi-axle loading vehicles. They had to cross this hostile city under the dim sky, so they had to be very vigilant. The soldier at the front of the mixed mecha squad didn't react in time, and Bai Yulan frowned. Through the optical camera on his helmet, he saw that in addition to a panicked man from the Empire, there was also a little girl whose hair was cut extremely messy sitting in the car. He understood why his subordinate's reaction was a little slow. Bai Yulan raised the K-15 long-range rifle in his arms and stood up expressionlessly. He made a standard half-squatting shooting position on top of the armored vehicle and pulled the trigger without any warning. A crisp gunshot rang out, and the bullet accurately hit the front steering wheel of the Empire vehicle. The vehicle was like a drunken man, stumbling and crashing into the tattered flower bed on the side of the street. The hood of the vehicle popped up with a bang, and smoke rose into the air. The soldiers of the Federation trembled slightly from the sudden gunshot. Although deep in their hearts, they were a little shocked by the overly sensitive nerves of their commanding officer. They were also a little worried about the frightened little girl in the car. However, no one dared to voice any dissatisfaction. Staff Sergeant Mime, go forward and check the situation. Be careful to maintain a safe distance. Bai Yulan put away the K-15 long-range rifle and sat back on the front of the vehicle. Following this order, one of the Federation armored vehicles drove forward. Staff Sergeant Mime was obviously a little relaxed, and the speed at which he approached was a little too fast. He drove to the side of the Empire vehicle in a few seconds. Bai Yulan put down the transparent helmet of his single soldier helmet and observed the situation through the optical camera. Suddenly, his pupils shrank slightly because he noticed that the Empire man in the vehicle seemed to be sweating too much, and the little girl in the passenger seat was crying non-stop. Fear would cause civilians to have similar reactions, but for some reason, Bai Yulan felt that this scene was a little strange, especially when he noticed that the armored vehicle of his squad was too close to the vehicle. Come back. He quickly issued orders to the armored vehicles in front through the infantry command system. However, what answered him and the entire mecha squad was a violent explosion. An unknown amount of explosives had been hidden in that Empire vehicle. The violent explosion instantly formed a giant fireball that was dozens of meters wide. The powerful shockwave followed closely behind, causing the cement and gravel on both sides of the street to fly up and hit the outer shells of the Federation mecha and armored vehicles. The man and the little girl in the Empire's vehicle were definitely dead, and Staff Sergeant Mime and the 3 Federation soldiers in the armored vehicle definitely couldn't have survived. Then, an even greater danger descended. At this moment, countless continuous sounds of explosions suddenly rang out from both sides of the street. The 2 skyscrapers that were about to collapse from the Federation's weapons suddenly spewed out endless smoke and dust. Amidst the incomparably chilling sounds of metal rubbing against concrete, the 2 skyscrapers collapsed with a loud rumble. Countless tons of concrete and steel poured down, forming a gigantic shadow of death that covered the heads of the 7 Federation MX mechas. Enemy attack. Plum Blossom Formation, disperse. Retreat to the direction of 3 p.m. Mecha. An Empire mecha has appeared. Ear-piercing shouts rose and fell within the command system. Suddenly encountering such a large-scale ambush on a quiet street, even the well-trained soldiers of the new 17th Division couldn't help but appear somewhat panicked. The armored vehicles that weren't crushed into the ruins of the buildings roared and retreated at high speed. Dozens of helmeted Federation soldiers carrying heavy firearms quickly spread out to both sides of the street. Almost instantly, who knew how many guns poked out from the buildings on both sides of the street and began to angrily spray bullets at the Federation soldiers downstairs. The Federation soldiers who used the large concrete blocks on the ground to hide their bodies hurriedly returned fire. However, from the corner of their eyes, they saw a shadow that made their hearts skip a beat. An Empire's newest model Wolf Fang mecha was rapidly rushing over from the end of the street. Its heavy body stepped on the uneven street, causing the earth to begin to tremble. South 32nd Street calling for backup. About 2 squads of surviving infantrymen, 1 surviving Wolf Fang mecha, left mechanical leg severely damaged, long-range firepower reduced by about 70%. By Magnolia, whose entire body was covered in dust, looked through the transparent helmet at the figure of the giant mecha charging over with a roar from the end of the street. There wasn't the slightest trace of panic on his face, and even his voice when communicating with base was calm. The dense gunshots that rang out all around the street didn't seem to enter his ears. Once he entered such a special area like the battlefield, this outstanding soldier of the Federal Forces could always display his most professional side. Xiong Linquan, hold down this broken left track. He looked at the Empire mecha that was beyond repair, its right shoulder still spitting out a violent rain of bullets. His eyes narrowed as he issued the order. Then, he crouched down, raised the long-range rifle in his hand, and calmly pulled the trigger at a window of a residential building in the sky to his left. The Federation armored vehicle that had retreated to the corner of another residential building suddenly rushed out with a roar. The heavy machine gun mounted on top of it roared and rotated. Long tongues of flame mixed with high-speed bullets fiercely fired at the Empire mecha that was hundreds of meters away. The outer armor of the Imperial Wolf Fang mecha could withstand a considerable amount of bullet damage, but the impact point of this heavy autocannon was compressed to an extremely precise degree. The powerful impact point was actually controlled within an extremely small area. No matter how fast the Imperial Wolf Fang mecha made evasive movements, the bullets fired from the heavy autocannon of the armored vehicle would always be able to accurately follow its footsteps, striking viciously against the outer armor of the Imperial Wolf Fang mecha. A strange white flower bloomed that seemed to never wither. An Empire soldier in tattered clothes howled in agony as he fell out of the window, landing on the street. His heart was pierced through by the steel bars in the concrete block. Bai Yulan rolled on the ground and immediately adjusted his shooting position, pulling the trigger at another window. Amidst a series of clean and efficient tactical movements, his eyes were still fixed on that most dangerous Empire mecha. He didn't know if those MX mecha could still fight after being submerged in the heavy concrete blocks. If they couldn't, before the base's air support arrived, he could only rely on himself and the others. The H-15 long-range rifle made the surface of his index finger feel slightly numb and itchy. Bai Yulan calmly fired as he issued a second order, load the grenades. Numerous fixed-point rockets with trails of white smoke flew out from an unknown corner, whistling towards the tall mecha that was stumbling under the pressure of Xiong Linquan's great gun. It was a pity that Gu Shifeng had been left behind at the command center of the division. Otherwise, with that fellow's abilities, this tattered Wolf Fang mech would not have been able to escape the surveillance from the very beginning. Amidst the rain of bullets, Bai Yulan fought expressionlessly. Her entire spirit seemed to have left the battlefield, returning to the days before Team 7 was disbanded. 1 hour and 47 minutes later. Why is there still a Wolf Fang mecha hidden in a safe zone that has been scanned by 3 bands? Also, those Empire soldiers snuck in from the southeast. Who is in charge of the blockade line there? Xiong Linquan, whose left arm was being bandaged by a medic, spat a mouthful of black saliva onto the ground. He stared at Colonel He Lei, who had come forward to express his concern. Around him, the mixed mecha team that had been ambushed by the Empire soldiers today had the same expression on their faces. Only Bai Yulan remained silent. She lowered her head and scratched her messy short hair that was covered in dust, allowing the dust to fall on Colonel He Lei's shiny military boots. The expression of the new 17th Division's 1st Regiment commander, He Lei, was also very ugly. He knew very well that although the officers in front of him did not have high ranks, and due to certain reasons, had never been valued by the federal military, no one dared to look down on them. The combat team at Nutshell Company had long been disbanded, and most of the new and old members had been dispersed to various combat units. However, names like Bai Yulan and Xiong Linquan were still remembered by the entire Federation. They were fierce characters that could only be subdued by someone as awesome as the instructor. They were once heroes, and they had the right to have such a direct conversation with any officer. What infuriated He Lei the most was that the southern area's defenses and waveband filtering work were all handled by that damned Iron 7th Division. If this mecha mixed team was really wiped out today, the new 17th Division would still be the one to bear the wrath of the big shots in the military, and the one to let down the instructor would still be the new 17th Division. This was the federal military's largest forward base on the planet. Other than the few units that were carrying out land-based cleanup missions, almost all of the high-ranking officers had been summoned back to the base to prepare for the upcoming pre-battle preparatory meeting. The officers of the new 17th Division and Iron 7th Division, these two iron-blooded units that had a history of grievances, were also forced to live under the same roof, although this roof was extremely spacious. This is a battlefield, Colonel He Lei. The commander of the Iron 7th Division, known for his coldness and arrogance, looked at the detestable people in front of him and frowned mockingly. How can there be a perfect defense? If you really don't want to die, then the best choice is to go home and take care of your children. Commander He Lei's eyes widened, and his fists clenched tightly. However, when he thought of his commander's strict orders, in the end, he could only take a deep breath. Dong Feng looked coldly at these members of the original 7th Division, and with his hands behind his back, he said, "Unorthodox mercenaries are never suited for proper combat." Then, he frowned and said, "Su Lu has been dead for a year. Why haven't you hooligans improved at all? Making a big fuss just because of a little thing, do you really think you're war heroes? Fuck, do you think you'll get milk just because you cry?" Chapter 654. Xiong Linquan's anger wasn't because Iron 7th Division mentioned Su Lu. It was more because of his comrades who died on the streets of the southern district of Fargar. However, sacrifice was too common on the battlefield to be used as a trigger for his anger. As a soldier of the Federation, he couldn't use the death of his comrades to express his anger towards Iron 7th Division, even if two of the people who died in the cement ruins used to be members of Iron 7th Division. For today's Federation, the once glorious Nutshell 7th Division didn't even exist. In the past year, the federal military and the official media had never mentioned the Nutshell Group 7 again. It was as if there was an invisible hand that was silently pushing this term into the pile of history books, deliberately ignoring the group of heroes that had once existed. After Iron's 7th Division was divided into various field units, its members were assigned to new combat positions. However, they were rarely used to take on difficult and glorious missions. On one hand, the Federation didn't want the heroes they created to become skeletons in coffins. On the other hand, there was a deeper reason. Bai Yulan knew the reason. There could only be one sun in the sky. Otherwise, it would be as hot as the Empire's mineral star that the 32nd Armored Brigade took down last month. In the competition for succession, the guy with the bright smile died. The Federation would naturally choose Du Shaoqing and his Iron 7th Division. Therefore, Iron 7th Division's mission in history was over. The Federation's fighting spirit had long been aroused by the documentary. Therefore, a combat squad like Iron 7th Division that had a clear brand and old grudges against Iron 7th Division naturally didn't need to continue existing. Iron 7th Division was disbanded, but its members were still there. Because of the old grudges and the rivalry between Iron 7th Division and the new 17th Division, the Iron 7th Division had always hated the officers from Iron 7th Division. As for high-ranking officers like Commander Dongfang, they didn't even bother to hide their disgust. However, Bai Yulan had to admit that the Iron 7th Division had the right to be proud and arrogant. Their commander, Du Shaoqing, commanded the Iron 7th Division like a god. The total number of soldiers in the Iron 7th Division that were converted into a full mecha division and expanded was now more than 40,000. During the invasion of the Empire, they had won many battles. The heroic scenes of the Iron 7th Division conquering a certain place appeared on the Federation's news channel at a terrifying frequency. It appeared in the eyes of millions of citizens of the Federation. Commander Shaoqing and his Iron 7 Division had gone from undefeated in the military exercise to the bloody battle at Silin and then to the invasion of the Empire. Their iron-like military exploits had made them the darling of the media, the idol of the people, the beloved general of the president and parliament, and even the future of the military. Faced with this kind of Iron 7th Division, even the new 17th Division, from the commander to the normal soldiers, could only keep a dark face. They inherited the sinister battle style and used their battle achievements to resist the might of the enemy, let alone the insignificant members of Iron 7th Division. The officers of Iron 7th Division had experienced this kind of mockery and even a face-slapping reprimand like today. Although the new 17th Division treated them well, and Commander He Lei and the other powerful Federation officers that Su Le had taught before also took care of the members who were scattered in their own units, the disregard from the Federation's upper echelons, as well as the contempt from certain units, made the days of Bai Yulan and the others truly difficult. If Boss was still alive, things would have developed completely differently. Bai Yulan lowered her head slightly and looked at the bloodstains on her military boots. She thought of the team member who died in her arms an hour ago, and naturally thought of the guy who died even earlier. She didn't pay attention to what the commander of Iron 7th Division in front of her was saying, nor did she pay attention to what Xiong Linquan was saying. In the past hundreds of days, he had long been used to this kind of situation and had always maintained an indifferent silence. In fact, ever since that infuriating little boss took the spaceship through the space channel, he was even a little tired of his military life and had thought of retiring. The reason he had taken back the retirement report and followed the main force into the Empire's planetary sector was because he wanted to see a miracle happen. If a miracle really did happen, he wanted to see the old comrades of Iron 7th Division return these guys to that guy in one piece. For this purpose, he had always been patient. However, the miracle didn't happen in the end. News spread in the Empire's planetary sector that guy had been executed half a year ago, and he had been patient, waiting for his old comrades to die one by one. Actually, I've always thought that Teacher Shaoqing wouldn't target small fries like us. Maybe it's just some despicable guy who thinks he's doing something. Bai Yulan broke the silence and slowly raised her head. Her extremely gentle face had a strange aura. She looked at the soldiers of Iron's 7th Division in front of her and said softly, "There's no evidence that something like today's incident is a conspiracy, and I don't believe that the great Iron 7th Division would do something like this. But this is still your fault. 5 of my people died, and 2 of them were old members of Iron's 7th Division." She looked at the indifferent commander of Iron's 7th Division and said softly but seriously, "Iron 7th Division? What's that? Does the Federal Forces have this kind of organization?" Commander Dongfang looked at her mockingly and raised his chin, revealing the stubbles full of ruthlessness. He said, "Or are you talking about a group of famous male actors? If you're talking about them, then in my eyes, they're just a bunch of good-for-nothings. No matter how many of them die, it's not worth feeling pity." Bai Yulan's expression didn't change. She narrowed her eyes and quietly listened to these cold and provocative words. She knew very well what the other party was waiting for. Ever since Su Lu made Du Shaoqing unable to fly into a rage at the training base that year, the entire Iron 7th Division had been waiting for a certain opportunity, an opportunity to vent their anger. Anyway, that guy was already dead. There were no miracles in this universe. She had to let her old comrades receive more respect and safety on the battlefield in the future. Bai Yulan licked her lips and patted the dust on her messy short hair. She looked at the other party and smiled. "Dongfang, fuck your mother." Since ancient times, this was one of the most effective profanities directed at one's heart. Once upon a time, Group 7, from top to bottom, loved to use this as a weapon. However, no matter whether it was Su Lu, who could say this sentence as tasteless as plain water, or Lan Xiaolong, who could say this sentence as melodious as music, none of them could compare to Magnolia's gentle and soft words. It was like a lover whispering into one's ear, causing one to feel endless humiliation. Everyone's expression changed. The eyes of the Iron 7 Division soldiers burned with cold fire. Bai Magnolia didn't seem to feel anything. She tilted her head slightly and looked at Commander Dongfang with interest. Her right index finger quietly touched the wooden handle of the military knife beside her leg. She didn't want to lose the reputation of the Iron 7 Division, but since she was going to do it, she had to do it thoroughly. She couldn't lose the reputation of the Iron 7 Division. Commander Dongfang's expression gradually darkened. However, before he could open his mouth to make any response, a bright and even magnificent light flashed past his eyes, extinguishing that cold and fierce flame. The delicate military knife cut through the air between Bai Yulan's fingers and cut Dongfang's wrist as he was about to reach for his gun. Along with a few drops of blood, the knife came to his neck and pressed against his chin that was full of stubble. Bai Yulan narrowed her eyes slightly and tilted her head to look at the skin under the blade. Her expression was very focused. She looked abnormally calm, but she gave people a very scary feeling. "Put the knife down." He Lei's eyes widened as he roared angrily. None of the soldiers of the Federation thought that Bai Yulan, the logistics officer of the 17th Division, would actually dare to pull out a knife against the famous Commander Dongfang of the Iron 7th Division. They didn't react for a moment. Only the officers of the Iron 7th Division pulled out their pistols. Bai Yulan's knee accurately and ruthlessly pressed against Dongfang's upper abdomen, the most vulnerable part of the diaphragm. Dongfang was pressed under her body and couldn't move at all. The angry roars and the sound of bullets behind her didn't affect her movements at all. She slowly moved her wrist, and the sharp blade moved up and slid across Dongfang's chin. Dongfang, who was coldly subdued by her, didn't have a trace of fear in his eyes. Instead, it was filled with a kind of cold joy. He was very satisfied that he could finally clean up Su Li's subordinates in the army. As for the danger at the moment, he didn't believe that Bai Yulan would dare to kill him. The cold blade that was slowly moving up his carotid artery was the proof. All of a sudden, the officer of the Federation who had made great military contributions screamed miserably. Bai Yulan, who had a focused expression, moved her fingers slightly, and the delicate military knife slid up his ear. Blood spurted out, the the screams and curses resounded throughout the room. Dongfang, who was restrained by the sharp knee and couldn't move, could only watch as his ear was gradually separated from his cheek. He felt the warm blood with a fishy smell flowing out. He felt the pain that was too close to his brain. He screamed in horror and anger. What made everyone feel cold was that Bai Yulan, who was cutting Dongfang's ear with the knife, didn't have the slightest change in expression. His delicate hand holding the delicate military knife was still as steady as ever. The scariest thing was that his movements were exceptionally slow, as if he was moving in slow motion. His right knee was pressed against Dongfang's abdomen, and his body was slightly tilted. He sat on Dongfang's body like a woman, doing the most bloody thing as if he was doing housework. The eyes of the surrounding Iron 7th Division officers had already turned red. The muzzles of their guns were ready to spit out bullets at any time to kill this devil-like man. However, Xiong Linquan had already picked up the Darlin machine gun. The 6 barrels of the gun were rotating at high speed. The key was that He Lei's reaction was too fast. As soon as the officers of the Iron 7th Division raised their guns, he rushed forward and blocked Bai Yulan's back. He lowered his right arm that was holding the pistol and aimed it at Dongfang's forehead. He shouted loudly, "Call the military police to deal with this. If anyone dares to fucking move, I'll shoot Dongfang first." Bai Yulan used 2 fingers to pick up the bloody earpiece. He frowned and looked at Dongfang, who was rolling on the ground with his face covered in blood. He said softly, "Now you know what the 7th Division is." He Lei, who was blocking in front of him, was already extremely frightened. After hearing this soft sentence, he broke out in a cold sweat. He finally understood that the guys who fought with the instructor back then were really a bunch of lunatics. Chapter 655. The Federal Army's forward operating base was located at the intersection of Route 47 and Route 123 on the main planet of Huang-Yi. Large engineering mechas were roaring like thunder gods as they excavated and cast cement on the outskirts of the base. In a meeting room deep inside the base, Commander He Lei's angry voice was louder than thunder. Around the semicircular meeting table sat more than a dozen stern-looking senior officers of the Federation. He Lei stood at the end of the table, slammed the table hard, and roared at the deputy commander of the Iron 7th Division, Lu Sifu. "What's going on with the defense in the Southern District? How did that Wolf Fang mech manage to sneak in under your noses? You're not done yet. If you don't explain this clearly today, I'm not done with you." Iron 7th Division's deputy commander Lu Sifu's expression was extremely gloomy as he scolded coldly, "Who are you not done with?" 7 MXs were buried alive in cement, and 1 damaged Wolf Fang mech caused heavy casualties to a mixed mech squad. As the commander, you still have the face to explain? Don't fucking try to change the topic, I'm asking you for someone right now. That bastard called Bai Yulan used such a cruel and bloody method to treat a senior officer with outstanding military service. If it wasn't for you, my people would have already shot him to death. Kill your mother. Countless veins popped out on He Lei's neck, but he couldn't make a strong counterattack. Whether or not the attack in the southern district of Farkle was a deliberate trap set by the Iron 7th Division, they didn't have any evidence. As for the bloody incident that happened in the base a few hours ago, no matter how one looked at it, Bai Yulan could only be executed on the spot. In the meeting room, besides the relevant officers of the Iron 7th Division and the new 17th Division, the Federation's frontline headquarters, the military police, and the Ministry of Internal Affairs were all present. Although the current Supreme Commander of the Federal Military, Commander Yi Changtian, didn't land on the surface from the battleship, he sent his personal staff to observe the situation. Right now, the room was filled with the angry roars of Commander He Lei and Vice Division Commander Lu Sifu. The rest of the generals and officers maintained an eerie silence, including Commander Yi's advisor. None of them seemed to have any intention of expressing their opinions. This bloody incident was very simple to deal with because the details of the case were clear. However, It was also very complicated because it involved the two trump cards of the Federation, as well as Group 7, which had been deliberately neglected for a long time. The most important thing was that the two division commanders sitting on both sides of the conference table had not spoken. The new 17th Division commander, Yu Qinghai, took off his military cap and silently stroked his white hair. His mood was very heavy. A few years ago, most of the old members of Nutshell Group 7 were retired soldiers of the 17th Division. Later on, most of the new and old members of Group 7 held positions in the new 17th Division, such as Ning He, Gu Shifeng, and many other outstanding soldiers. Thus, even though the upper echelons of the Federation had always treated Group 7 coldly, as the commander of the 17th Division, he naturally paid more attention to these people. The 17 mechanics had all been equipped with 108 of the new MX mecha, and he had allocated 7 mecha to that mecha mixed team. The hidden meaning behind this was very obvious. However, who would have thought that such an ambush would occur on the Southern District's main road? Even more so, no one would have thought that Bai Yulan would choose such a bloody and cruel method of revenge. Commander Yu Qinghai smiled slightly. Looking at the Major General across the round table, his mood was very gloomy. Although from start to finish, the other had maintained his silence, not saying a single word, it was very clear that Bai Yulan would not be able to be saved this time. Because Commander Du Shaoqing was not wearing his sunglasses today, which was very rare. That face, which was usually as unshakable as a glacier and cedar tree, clearly displayed a sullen anger. His eyebrows, which were like unsheathed swords, were slightly raised. He would not turn back until he saw blood. As an excellent military commander, shielding his subordinates was an essential quality. Otherwise, why would he let his subordinates risk their lives for him? As the Federation's brightest and most unstoppable young military commander, Commander Du Shaoqing, who could make tens of thousands of Iron 7th Division soldiers throw themselves into the river with a single order, was naturally a model example. Now, one of the two senior officers who had followed him the longest and was most trusted by him, Dongfang, had his ear cut off by Bai Yulan in front of everyone. How could he bear it? Commander Yu, who came from a logistics background, was not a typical soldier with a strong personality. However, when faced with Du Shaoqing's cold and oppressive aura, which seemed to come from the depths of the earth, he was still able to maintain an extremely gentle expression on his face. In a soft voice, he explained, breaking military rules naturally requires punishment. However, this is after all within the jurisdiction of the Military Police Brigade and the Internal Affairs Department. Therefore, I do not agree to your request to be detained by yourself. He absolutely could not allow the Iron 7th Division to detain Bai Yulan. Otherwise, those soldiers, whose eyes were burning red with anger, would definitely make Bai Yulan suffer more than death. This was also the bottom line of the new 17th Division. The Federal Army valued discipline above all. Previously, he dared to point at Commander Lu and curse him because he was now promoted to colonel, which was the same rank as Commander Lu Sifu. At this moment, Teacher Yu Qinghai, who had been silent all this while, opened his mouth to speak. The meeting room instantly quietened down. Everyone's gaze turned towards Teacher Du Shaoqing's face. At this moment, only he had the qualifications to continue this confrontation between the two great aces. Du Shaoqing maintained an indifferent attitude and did not speak. The pair of sunglasses and military cap that were neatly placed in front of him seemed to emit some kind of terrifying aura along with his silence. Just as the atmosphere was about to explode from the oppressive atmosphere, the staff officer who had been watching for a long time finally connected to the Federal Forces flagship outside the atmosphere. The Army's Supreme Commander, Commander Yi, appeared in front of everyone with a dignified expression. We are the army that bears the expectations of hundreds of millions of Federation citizens and Mr. President. Our journey should be to the Sea of Stars. 5 days later, the army will embark on the journey to attack the X3 star ocean. You should know better than me what taking down the 3 shadow mineral stars means to this war. Do you think that such a trivial matter is qualified to affect the war? The generals and officers in the conference room stood up together and saluted the respected old general on the hologram, quietly listening to the final instructions. What was strange was that Commander Du Shaoqing, who had always paid the most attention to the army's discipline and the dignity of the commanding officer, who had never made the slightest mistake, stood up much slower than usual today. The lines on his indifferent face looked particularly stiff. Use the shortest amount of time to settle this matter. Commander Yi on the hologram waved his arm vigorously. Du Shaoqing took a deep breath. After putting on his military cap, he seriously adjusted his direction and saluted to the hologram. He said steadily, "Yes. Du Shaoqing, you can state your request," Commander Yi on the hologram said. "I don't have any request. I believe that after the investigation by the Internal Affairs Division, the military court will give a fair verdict." Du Shaoqing was expressionless. After a short pause, he said quietly, "But this person must die." He didn't have any request, but he used the word must to describe the word death. Commander Du Shaoqing's tone was indifferent and calm, but it was filled with a palpitating calmness after anger. Everyone knew that he was truly angry. Bai Yulan must die. This was the Iron 7th Division's and his most simple request. Then Bai Yulan was dead for sure. Old He, what's the result? Colonel Ning He, the top advisor of the staff of the new 17th Division, stopped He Lei with a worried face and asked with a hint of expectation and fear. He was also a member of the 7th Division. Before Su Lu joined the 7th Division, he had worked with Bai Yulan on the battlefield for many years. They had a close relationship. Of course, he was very worried about this friend of his. Handed over to the military police, investigated by the Internal Affairs Division, and then sent to the military court. He Lei rubbed his numb face and said in a low voice, "They want to expedite the process. The secret trial will probably start tomorrow." Ning He exhaled softly, smiled bitterly, and said, "As long as he isn't secretly killed by the Iron 7th Division, it's fine. Although he might have to go to jail for 7 to 8 years, being alive is better than anything else." He Lei looked at him sadly and said, "Don't comfort yourself. Commander Shaoqing has said that old Bai must die. Fuck him. He just tore off an ear. Is there a need to exchange his life for it?" Ning He roared angrily. "This is the front line. This is the most special time of war. As a subordinate, Bai Yulan cut off the ear of a superior officer in front of so many people. It's natural for him to be executed on the spot. He Lei lit a cigarette and smoked with all his might. He said with a serious expression, "Do you know? Before he was subdued, he cut off Dongfang's ear again. Dongfang's ear turned into 16 pieces. The medical officer couldn't sew it back up for Dongfang. This fucking knife skill is beautiful. How can Commander Shaoqing allow him to live?" At this time, a few officers were surrounding the two of them, listening to He Lei's words silently. They were the new 17th Division's Mecha Brigade's captain, Hua Xiaoxi, who had come with Gu Shifeng, and the Lin family, who was the air and ground liaison officer. Gradually, more soldiers came over. There were squad leaders, platoon leaders, company commanders, and normal soldiers. They silently gathered together. They understood these principles. In a strictly disciplined army, the most intolerable thing was to offend one's superiors. Furthermore, this was the most tense time of war. Bai Yulan had used bloody methods to harm a superior officer. There was no way he could escape punishment. However, they didn't want to accept this reality because they were once members of Iron 7th Division. They were once training officers at the training base. Because of some dead guy, they had fought side by side more than once and trusted each other with their lives. Zhou Yu, who was greatly appreciated by Du Shaoqing and had now become an important staff officer of the Iron 7th Division, stood in the distance and looked at his old friends with cold expressions. He wanted to walk over, but he couldn't lift his leg. Lan Xiaolong, who had been transferred to the headquarters as Commander Yi's staff officer, walked out of the meeting room. He looked at the crowd with a complicated expression. He wanted to walk over, but was coldly blocked by the former medical officer of Iron's 7th Division, Ho Xiandong. After boss died, you were transferred away. No one blames you. Everywhere is war, right? But the problem is, you shouldn't have lied to us in the first place. You're an important person to the Ministry of Defense. Why would you mix around with mercenaries like us? Old Feng is dead. 13th floor is dead. Jia Si is dead. Last night on Fahale Street, Jia Si's blood brother is dead. You should know why Ol Bai is so angry. Ol Bai only has 2 sons. Okay, none of this matters. But now, even Old Bai is going to die. Now that you're the trusted aide of the Commander-in-Chief, did you say anything for him? The corner of Lan Xiaolong's mouth twitched slightly. In the end, he didn't say anything. He nodded at the crowd and walked towards the battleship in the distance. Bai Yulan, who had oily hair floating in front of her forehead and slender legs, was going to die. Some of his dear friends were in pain, some had left long ago, and some had no choice, but they couldn't find any way to stop this from happening. At this moment, He Lei, Gu Shifeng, and Xiong Linquan, who was arrested at the same time. These people were probably thinking about one thing. If boss was still alive, things would definitely be very different. Chapter 656. Su Lu was dead. The high and mighty families in the Federation, as well as the politicians who had dirty water flowing between their fingers, had had an easy year. Although the young Federation officer did not seem to be eye-catching, and he did not seem to have any power that could shake the world, the saber light on the Tiger Mountain Road, the axe marks in the Research Institute, the gunshots in the Foundation building, and the strong straight footprints and bullet holes on the beach of other manors made the big shots, who were used to setting the rules of the world with wine parties, lunches, and insider trading, discover in a cold voice that Su Lu was a person who did not walk the normal path and had the strength to step on the path set by the world into chaos. He had an extreme view of good and evil that did not conform to the temperament of the people of this universe. He was a horrible and abominable person who should have died a long time ago but had not died. Fortunately, Su Lu, who should have died a long time ago, finally died in the hands of the people of the Empire because of his revenge. The big shots of the Federation lamented in front of others, as sad as the death of their black-haired nephew, but when they were silent, they could not help but smile with fragrant tea in their hands, rejoicing that the stone that had been hanging above their heads all the time, waiting for them to make the slightest move, had finally disappeared. Similarly, many people missed the time when Su Lu existed and regretted his passing, such as the Federation soldiers who fought bloody battles on the front lines, the ordinary people whose relatives and friends were innocently killed by conspiracies, the revolutionary young women in the Parliament Mountain, the unmarried mothers in the courtyard of the West Mountain, the rogue princes who quietly scattered blue light in their pockets, the officials and reporters who still had some light in their hearts, and many, many, many more. You can miss him, but this kind of miss cannot become a heavy burden that makes life heavy. The Nanxiang family, the most low-key of the 7 families, had an equally low-key and quiet manor in the middle of a blue lake deep in the mountains. This low-key was because no one knew about it deep in the mountains, but not because of the luxurious furnishings of the manor itself. Just like the madam who stood quietly by the window of the bedroom on the 2nd floor, wearing expensive clothes, but indifferently stood in front of the window and watched the smoke-like light rain in the manor. A few decades ago, Chao Jiaran, the outstanding female student from the 1st Military Academy's Command Department, had been the Southern Prime Minister's wife for many years, but she was still as indifferent as ever. She turned back to look at her tired daughter and said softly, "It's rare for you to come back from S2 for a break. You should have a good rest, but I feel that there's something I have to tell you because it's related to happiness, true happiness." The tedious work of the 4 prefectures Reconstruction Foundation caused Nan Xiangmei's beautiful face to have a trace of inexplicable melancholy. Listening to her mother's serious words, she gently pursed her lips and slightly lowered her head to remain silent. No matter how big the conflict between you and your family is, your mother will always stand by your side, right? Mrs. Nan said with a smile, I have never objected to your relationship with Lieutenant Colonel Sulu. I even secretly encouraged you to show more courage. He was already a colonel in the end. Nan Xiangmei raised her head and looked at her mother with a pout. It was rare for her to show a trace of naivety this year. Well, it's Colonel Sulu. Mrs. Nan Xiangmei walked over and gently stroked her daughter's hair. Her smile gradually faded and she said seriously, but now he's dead. I don't want you to be depressed for the rest of your life because of this matter. I'm not, Mother. Nan Xiangmei seriously retorted. No, listen to me. In a woman's life, the most important thing is peace. Mrs. Nan Xiangmei said with love and pity, I'm not asking you to find a new love, I just want you to cheer up. Remember, really cheer up. Not like you have been doing this year, numbing yourself with overloaded work to force yourself not to think about him, but to truly have a happy and regretless life. Nan Xiangmei's long eyelashes fluttered slightly and she said softly, Mother, what is true happiness? Grandfather let you marry father, are you really happy these years? Uncle Tian has never married in his life, have you ever regretted it? Mrs. Nan Xiangmei quietly thought for a long time and said with a smile, thinking about it carefully, there's nothing to regret. Your Uncle Tian is a very good man, but he won't necessarily be a good husband or a good father. Sunset State Latitude 17th Road, Shilin, on a black street surrounded by green trees, a fleet of cars was roaring along. Occasionally, the high-speed wheels would pick up a piece of broken leaf and toss it high into the air. Then, it would be hit by the following cars and roll over again. The motorcade of 4 expensive black cars and 16 dark green bulletproof military vehicles was amazing and very rare. However, the residents of the West Woods who stood on both sides of the street didn't have the slightest shock on their faces, because they saw this scene every day and knew that the little princess of the West Woods was going to school again. With curiosity and desire to spy, the residents craned their necks to look at the center of the street, trying to see which car the little princess was in through the film glass, but it was in vain. Suddenly, someone heard an impressive angry voice of a man coming from one of the expensive black cars. Who the hell said I can't be a good father? Give me the exercise book, I want to take a look again. Mr. Tian had become fatter than before. His angry or embarrassed eyes had become 2 slits on his chubby face. He took the electronic exercise book from the little hands and looked at it for a long time with a frown. In the end, it turned into a sigh. When I was in the first academy, I was specially allowed to not study advanced mathematics. Yanhua, don't laugh, this is a privilege that only the genius of mecha warfare can enjoy. Zhong Yanhua didn't laugh, her clear eyes didn't curve into a cute pair of eyes. Her neatly cut short black hair swayed slightly with the movement of the car, like 2 pieces of watermelon skin. The little girl silently looked at the opposite side, silently took back the electronic exercise book, and silently turned her head to look at the scenery of the West Woods outside the window. She didn't say a word. The ancient bell was attacked, and her parents were buried in that sad and beautiful cosmic fireworks. Then, Sulu took revenge on a single ship and disappeared at the other end of the universe. On the day she found out about this bad news, the little girl told Mr. Tian that from now on, she had to study hard and learn how to take care of herself. From the moment she said this, Zhong Yanhua started to live like this. She woke up on time, ate her meals, washed up, and trained according to the daily schedule recommended by life experts. She started to practice her survival skills according to the federal military's Special Warfare Survival Manual. She started to pick up the special knife of the West Woods Special Warfare Brigade to learn. But until now, only 2 cockroaches had died under the little girl's knife. The little girl's temperament became a little irritable, and her neat watermelon skin-like hair was often twisted into an ugly mess by her small scissors. Besides that, she became a little quiet that didn't match her age. Like now, she often looked at the outside environment silently and didn't say a word. Fatty Tian looked at the side of the little girl's face by the window. Although he was used to her silence, he couldn't help but sigh deeply in his heart. The imposing motorcade stopped at the entrance of the school. The swift and fierce Shilin soldiers had long since taken control of all positions. Little friend Zhong Huiyan pushed open the car door and walked down, politely bowing slightly to Fatty Tian who was in the car. Fatty Tian waved his hand and said as gently as possible, "Go, study hard." He thought that as usual, he wouldn't get an answer from Zhong Yanhua, but he didn't expect that the situation was a little different today. The little girl stood by the car and was silent for a moment. The cool morning breeze blew the hair on her cheeks to below her earlobes. Then, she turned around and looked into the car and said very seriously, "Uncle Tian, being a genius doesn't mean that you don't know advanced mathematics. I think brother Su Lu must be very good at mathematics." After hearing this, Mr. Tian was stunned for a long time and muttered a few words in a low voice. Then, he noticed a familiar black car parked on the street opposite the school gate. The black car didn't have any logo, but that was the most obvious sign. I have to admit that taking care of a child is much more difficult than fighting a war. Big Stick Tian walked to the side of the black car and looked at the thin young man behind the slowly lowered window. He shrugged and said, "Su Lu is the Almighty One. Yes, he also knows where the best porridge and scallion pancakes are." Hearing the name of his old friend, Tai Ziyuan, who was in the car, smiled and said with a trace of longing, "I found a porridge shop a few days ago. The taste is not bad, so I'll treat you to breakfast today." The young master of the Tai family and Mr. Tian, the representative of the old house on Wire Road, had breakfast together. Of course, it wasn't as simple as reminiscing about the past in the library. For some reason that even he couldn't understand, after the explosion of the ancient bell, Tai Ziyuan adjusted his life plan and came to the West Woods to open a law firm called Shizhou Law Firm. Shizhou Law Firm now hired the son of the Chief Justice of the Federation, He Ying, as its chief legal counsel. They were fighting a family property lawsuit that made the whole Federation suffer. The current situation in the West Woods was a bit tense. Under the strong suppression of Mr. Tian and Li Feng, the despicable relatives of the Zhong family didn't dare to do anything too outrageous. Zhong Ziki, who was elected as the heir of the family, needed the support of the Federation government and the other families more than ever. It was also because of this rare opportunity that the big shots of the capital ring finally reached into the West Woods. Other than the three mechanics around the capital of the Sunset State, the Federation government and the Department of Defense were gradually taking control of the entire West Woods military region. This situation seemed to be unstoppable. Zhong Ziki and the greedy elders in the family naturally couldn't see the hidden danger behind this trend. However, they were already riding on the dead mad tiger, so how could they stop? The circuit courts have been all over. Unless we go to the Supreme Court, no one dares to make a decision on this case. Tai Ziyuan gently stirred the vegetable porridge in his bowl and said with a smile, "Of course, even if these courts dare to make a decision, neither side will admit it. In the end, we will still have to go to the Supreme Court." An image of an old man with a face full of wrinkles appeared in Mr. Tian's mind. He thought that only the Chief Justice, who even the god of war couldn't do anything about, had the courage to end the chaos in the West Woods. He frowned and said, "The problem is that the lawyers over there, and the despicable Ministry of Justice have been using those legal means to prevent this case from going to the Supreme Court. The most disgusting thing is that bunch of bastards in the Management Committee. They actually pushed for an amendment on Parliament Hill, saying that in order to save the Federation's legal costs, secondary civil cases like inheritance rights can't go to the Supreme Court. Fuck. When the Federation TV station and the Children's Rights Fund fought that Jian Shuier case in the Supreme Court, those damn senators just watched the show and didn't say anything." Tai Ziyuan raised his head and looked at the angry Fatty Tian. He sighed and said, "There's good news. Yesterday, the Supreme Court ruled that this amendment is unconstitutional. According to the procedure, my law firm will be able to send this case to Justice Heing in 20 days at most." Mr. Tian laughed, then immediately froze and asked, "Don't tell me it's bad news?" "Yes." Tai Yuan's expression was a little strange, but it wasn't heavy. Instead, it had a slight trace of mockery. "I have a falling out with my family." Stick Tian's expression suddenly became serious. He knew that this bad news was definitely not a simple story of a young master falling out with his family. It represented that after a year of silence, the Madam of Macho's back mountain finally decided to show her true attitude. The commander is dead. Everyone wants to take a bite out of the West Woods. Now it seems that the lady has been silent for a year because of you, but she won't be silent forever. Mr. Tian's smile was a little bleak. He whispered, "What a magnificent and grand robbery." In the asteroid belt behind the gravitational field of the L9 galaxy of the Imperium in the left sky space zone, there was a sailing route that had never appeared on the official star map of the Imperium. Countless audacious smugglers, countless local nobles and officers who stole the wealth of the Imperium to enrich their personal pockets, and countless ruthless and unpredictable pirates were driving their own spaceships in the secret sailing route, playing the dangerous but highly exciting bloody money games. For the Red-Beard pirates, they had always held the initiative in this game for more than a decade. More than a dozen high-speed pirate ships with stacked engines were like more than a dozen cruel and hungry sharks, swimming in the shadows of the channel. When they encountered delicious and weak targets, they would reveal their mouths full of sharp white teeth and rush out to rob everything they could. However, today, their pirate ships with powerful engines and amazing speed were the targets of robbery. Why? 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 Why haven't we gotten rid of it yet? A pirate with a red beard looked at the spaceship on the screen that seemed to be made of broken metal. He held his head with both hands and let out a shrill and desperate cry. At this moment, he, who was famous for his cold-blooded and cruel smuggling channel, looked more like a crazy and neurotic philosopher. After searching for the meaning of life without any results, he let out a cry of despair to the sky. The next moment, he would cut off his own ears. Because of the war between the Federation and the Empire, the resources of the L9 star system suddenly became scarce, and the price of all kinds of black market goods soared. Because they could not resist this charming temptation, the Red-Beard pirates knew that the Empire's fleet had now tightly sealed the exits of the smuggling channel, but they still quietly entered this channel, preparing to secretly eat up those bold smuggling fleets. Unexpectedly, their pirate ships were not blown to pieces by the Empire's official fleet, but they were targeted by a spaceship full of broken metal components that came out of nowhere. Moreover, it was targeted for half a month. The pirate fleet that rampaged the smuggling channel at high speed was completely unable to get rid of this broken spaceship. As for the air battle, His Majesty the Emperor, in the first 3 minutes, 2/3 of the entire Red-Beard pirate spaceships were smashed into scrap metal floating in space by that broken spaceship. Red-Beard had never seen such a fast spaceship in his life. He had never seen such a sturdy spaceship, and he had never seen such a fearless captain. A large hole had clearly appeared in the abdomen of that broken spaceship, revealing the cabin equipment inside. How could the people inside still be alive and dare to ram into his ship without regard for their own lives? Looking at the screen getting closer and clearer, the bow of the spaceship full of broken metal components was like a deformed metal monster. Red-Beard's pupils shrank smaller and smaller. Suddenly, his face turned red and he roared, "Full engine forward. Since we can't escape, we'll ram into it." I don't believe that the people in that spaceship are really not afraid of death. At this moment, the pirate leader responsible for technical monitoring beside him said in a trembling voice, "Boss, please don't. I always feel that this ship is a little strange. Do you remember the ship mentioned after the Namutso pirates were annihilated last time?" When Red-Beard heard this, he could not help but think of the rumor. The Namutso pirates, whose strength was definitely not below Redbeard's, suddenly disappeared 3 months ago. Later, a pirate who luckily survived in an escape capsule trembled all over and told what had happened to them, but no pirate group believed him. They all felt that the pirate must have been scared out of his wits. Ghost ship. Redbeard stared at the broken metal spaceship that was still suspended tens of thousands of kilometers away on the screen. It was motionless as if there was no life in it. Redbeard's flushed face suddenly turned extremely pale, and he said 3 words in a trembling voice. At this moment, the remote communication system on the pirate ship turned on without anyone touching it. A cold mechanical voice that seemed to have no rhythm and emotional fluctuations suddenly sounded in the hall. The frightened pirates were so frightened by this voice that their legs went soft and they fell to the ground. Good morning, everyone. Hello, everyone. This is the old Butler spaceship. Thank you very much for stopping by. The cold mechanical voice resounded throughout the hall. Please pay attention. The robbery will begin now. I don't want women, nor do I want men, nor do I want underwear. The mechanical voice continued without any emotional fluctuations. This is a joke. In order to prevent you from doing strange things that are beyond my logical judgment because of being too nervous, I hope you can relax a little. The following is the list of robberies. 1 turbulent nozzle cleaning valve for your ship's engine. 1 X-shaped support steel beam, the strength requirement is level 3. 2 timer calibrators. The broken metal spaceship that the pirates called the Ghost Ship slowly listed its robbery list through the remote communication system. As many as dozens of spaceship components or parts of unknown purposes appeared on the list. At the end, the voice said, and all of your crystal ores. And all the crystal ores on your ship. Here's a friendly reminder, the way your ship is using the engine is an incomprehensible waste of crystal ores. If necessary, you can head to the X3 galaxy and contact the federal troops to upgrade and modify the engine power system. Sulu didn't know how many people in the Federation missed him, but he believed that there were definitely people who missed him. He was curious about the names of those people and was very satisfied. For those people, he asked the Empire's underground resistance organization to send back the news that he was still alive as soon as possible. However, the left Sky Star region was full of flames of war, and communication was extremely difficult. If he was really lucky enough to return to the Federation, the news might not have reached him yet. At this time, he didn't know that some of those who missed him and were missed by him were facing execution. Otherwise, he definitely wouldn't have been able to wait for even 10 minutes on this planet controlled by smugglers and vacationing pirates. After leaving Tianjing on the Empire's military transport ship, the first 10 days of space travel were very safe. There were no problems with the identity forged by the resistance organization. However, when they quietly left the Empire's warship and boarded the smuggling spaceship to continue their escape, the situation suddenly became tense. Because of the war, the Empire's fleet increased the frequency of cruising in the star regions within their borders. Even the secret smuggling routes that were usually considered to be outside of the Empire's jurisdiction actually appeared. The closer they were to the front lines of the battlefield, the stricter the Empire's official inspection. The tactic of using money to clear the way in the past was now completely useless. In just 4 days, Sulu and the others encountered several fatal crises. The resistance organization's soldiers kept dying to protect them as they moved forward with difficulty, all the way until they landed on the most remote planet in the L9 galaxy. During this escape journey, Su Li's view of the underground resistance organization changed greatly. This was especially so when he looked at Mr. Muen, who still wore an expensive leather robe and had a bleak expression on his face. In his heart, Mr. Muen kept leveling up. The leveling up here wasn't referring to this person's powerful methods, but to other aspects. When he first saw Muen, Sulu thought that he was just a gangster boss who occupied the slums of the capital city. He only had a few casinos, repair shops, and over 100 lousy guns. However, when he left the capital city and began to flee for his life on Tianjing planet, he discovered that Mu'en was one of the few underworld leaders on Tianjing planet. No matter which province or county he was in, his underworld gang could display its powerful abilities. After leaving Tianjing planet and coming to the vast universe, Sulu finally understood that this seemingly boorish and unsophisticated fellow actually had influence over the entire left sky star field. Countless smugglers and pirate leaders had to treat him with respect when they saw him. Sulu licked his dry lips and looked at the heavily polluted air above this adventurer's paradise planet. He couldn't help but frown as he thought of the Donglin region. With Mr. Mu'en's help, perhaps he could really pass through the layers of blockades of the imperial armies and complete the impossible return this time. Thinking of this, a smile and homesickness surfaced on his face. Shortly after, he thought of another matter. The old man had once asked him to go to the Great Master Fan Manor to investigate the clues left behind by the AI chip. However, he had been struggling between life and death during those days and had completely forgotten about this matter. Now that he was about to return, there probably wouldn't be a chance to investigate it. Perhaps he would wait until the federal forces attacked Tianjing before he went to that small white courtyard to take a look. Right, there was also Aunt Susan. When the time came, he would also have to go and take a look. Paul wouldn't really be going to the battlefield, right? He was still in a dangerous place within the Empire, but he began to imagine the beautiful scene when he returned in the future. It had to be said that the cheerful and optimistic fighting spirit had long been deeply rooted in Su Li's bones. However, the worried and heavy voice of Mr. Mu'en next to him instantly destroyed these optimistic imaginations. There's a big problem. Mr. Mu'en's palm stroked the rough skin under his smooth leather jacket as he looked at the spaceport more than 10 kilometers in front of the hotel's floor-to-ceiling glass window. With a serious expression, he said, "The latest news is that the military has taken control of the spaceport and allowed spaceships to land, but banned all aircraft from taking off. I don't know if this is wartime control or if the military has detected something and is taking measures specifically to target you." Sulu suddenly turned around and looked into Mr. Mu'en's eyes. Mr. Mu'en lit the thick tobacco in his hand and said with a frown, "Because of you, the Empire has blocked the smuggling route for a long time. The resistance of the nobles and merchants was too strong, so it gradually loosened later. We have always taken the path of the military. As long as we have enough money, we can get through. But this time, it really won't work. Now, none of the officers dare to accept money." Mu'en walked back to the room and took out the workbench. He opened a three-dimensional star map and slid a thin line on the corner of the star map that was magnified 400 times. He whispered, "The most important thing now is this line. Of all the smuggling routes, this is the most secretive one, and the military should not have grasped it. The problem is that the military has directly taken control of the spaceport. The most terrifying thing is that an Empire light fleet came out of nowhere and blocked all the entrances of this smuggling route. It seems that even if the military does not have the specific data of the route, they have a general understanding of the situation. If our ship can enter this route, then turn right in the direction of 23:33:17 from the exit and pass through these three spatial gates, we will be able to reach the periphery of the X3 system." Mr. Mu'en pointed at the dots of light on the star map with the thick tobacco in his hand and said slowly, "According to the information we received, your army is now preparing to attack X3. The problem is that in this half a month, no other spaceship has the opportunity to sneak in except for the Red-Beard pirates. What is your suggestion?" Sulu asked. "I can't give any suggestions now. We can only wait," Mr. Mu'en answered directly. Sulu sighed softly and turned to look at the spaceport outside the window. He felt that the road home was so close to him, but why was it so far away? At this moment, his sharp eyes caught sight of a few small black dots at the spaceport. The ships were slowly taking off. The flames from the bottom of the ships distorted the light in the air, flattening the small sun on the horizon. "Didn't we say that no spaceships are allowed to take off?" Sulu asked with narrowed eyes. Muan was also extremely puzzled. His brows were tightly knitted together, and after looking for a moment, his pupils suddenly shrank as he said, "Colonel Sulu, it looks like I can only send you off here." Su Li's pupils also shrank nervously at this moment. The two of them noticed at almost the same time that after those few spaceships took off from the spaceport, they didn't fly out of the atmosphere. Instead, they flew straight for the hotel they were in at a terrifying speed. The temporarily set up alarm sounded sharply. Muan dragged out a heavy firearm from under the bed and threw it to Sulu. He ran out of the room and shouted, "We're definitely being watched. Run by yourself." Sulu caught the firearm with a flip of his wrist and slung it over his shoulder. He rushed out of the room and ran along the corridor full of glass windows in a different direction. He shouted, "Who are they?" Throughout the entire process of escaping, Mr. Muan was able to remain calm no matter what kind of danger he encountered. Out of the corner of his eye, he looked at the few Imperial military spaceships approaching at high speed. He looked at the golden hibiscus insignia on the spaceships and said in a trembling voice, "The Royal Special Mecha Battalion." Sulu, who was running at high speed, paused slightly. He looked out the window at the spaceships that had already flown to the hotel. He looked at the bottom of the spaceships that were slowly cracking open, and at the dozen or so cold steel mechas that sent chills down his spine. He subconsciously tightened his grip on the firearm on his shoulder. He thought with a trace of coldness in his heart, "What can this gun do?" "Your Highness, we just received news that the Royal Special Mecha Battalion team hiding on the L9 transit planet has successfully found the remnants of the resistance organization. They also found the location of that fugitive from the Federation. According to your instructions, the Royal Special Mecha Battalion has already started the killing operation. If there are no accidents, we should have the latest news in about 3 minutes." Hui Chaoshi, who was standing by the window, calmly looked at the fleets that were retreating into the heart of the Empire in the Dark Universe. She thought about the killing operation on the L9 system behind her. She didn't know why, but she slightly furrowed her brows. In the beginning, she didn't think much of that guy. She just didn't expect that guy to be like a cockroach that couldn't be killed no matter what. He gradually became a thorn in her heart. Now that this thorn was about to be removed, why didn't she feel the satisfaction of success? Hui Chaoshi wasn't disappointed that the cleanup operation against the underground resistance organization in the slums didn't manage to kill Sulu. On the contrary, it made her more confident that she could kill Sulu. That enemy who didn't play by the rules in the past was now mixed in with the remnants of the resistance organization. It seemed like he had many helpers, but in reality, he also revealed many tales formed by shadows. As long as they followed the trail of the resistance organization, they would be able to find out where he was. During the space journey leading the second batch of Wolf Fang mecha squadrons to the front lines, Hui Chaoshi continuously sent instructions to the Royal Intelligence Agency and the relevant military departments. The Royal Intelligence Agency was very clear on the style of the resistance organization. After combining all the information, the Empire set their sights on the L9 system. Hui Chaoshi agreed with this judgment. From planet Tianjing to the edge of the left sky galaxy, there were many paths. However, now that the flames of war were blazing, if they wanted to leave the Empire, there was only one path left. Although they couldn't see each other and were separated by stars, she definitely had to kill Sulu within the Empire's borders. She definitely wouldn't allow him to return to the Federation alive. Thus, she had long made preparations to block this only path of survival into a dead end. Pass down my orders. Transfer the 14 Night Wolf battleships of the Heaven's Eye formation to the designated area and block the exit of that secret space route. Because of some kind of warning, Hui Chaoshi added an order without any warning. Your Highness, because they were used to seal off the space route, too many battleships have already been transferred. The space defense of the X3 system is already very weak. Now, you still want to transfer more battleships over. the officer looked at Her Highness in shock. He didn't understand why Her Highness would make such an unnecessary move when that Federation fugitive was clearly going to die. We were going to give up on the X3 system anyway. Hui Chaoshi looked at the grand and majestic cosmic retreat in front of the battleships that carried a trace of sorrow and magnificence. She took a deep breath, narrowed her eyes, and said, "Even if that guy can fight for a sliver of a chance of survival in the impossible, I will still destroy him." The hotel's large and luxurious glass wall was instantly reduced to a pile of wreckage by the terrifying gunfire of the dozen or so cold mecha that were about 6 meters tall. Countless cries of pain and sporadic gunshots rang out in the corridor. Immediately after that, the dozen or so Wolf Fang mecha rushed out at high speed, chasing after that figure in the morning light. The leaves on the street fell from the mecha's high-speed advance. Who knew how many houses were reduced to ruins under the heavy mechanical feet of countless people, and who knew how many people died because of this? The fleeing figure seemed so lonely, yet so resolute and ruthless. It was as if there was an engine installed on his legs. With a speed that was beyond human imagination, he climbed over the wall in front of him, stepped over the ancient trees in front of him, and turned into a shining shadow under the morning light, all the way forward. However, the speed of a human was ultimately no match for the speed and agility of the Wolf Fang mecha. It didn't take long before the dozen or so mecha from the Empire's Royal Special Mecha Battalion coldly caught up to him and forced him into a park hidden in a dense forest by the side of the road. Whoosh, 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 whoosh. Fallen leaves danced in the air as gray shadows flashed past. A series of powerful mecha-specific shrapnel swept the thick ancient trees in the park in half. Sulu was extremely lucky to have avoided the death-reaping of these terrifying shrapnel. Using his fastest speed, he rushed to the top of the mountain and then stopped. Running for his life was not scary. He seemed to have spent his entire life on the run. What was scary was that right now, he had no idea where to run to. Death was also not scary. Early on, after his family had died in the mining accident, he had spent a long time planting that seed of fearlessness in his heart. What was scary was that he might die in a foreign country and no one would know. Using his own 2 legs to compete in speed with the Empire's mecha, rushing through the streets, ancient trees, and swamps to reach the top of the small mountain, it was truly inconceivable. However, the seemingly endless strength in his body had also been depleted by this terrifying sprint. Looking at the falling trees all around him and the metal reflections of the mecha that lit up from time to time between the trees, Sulu gently exhaled a mouthful of turbid air to relieve the dizziness caused by the lack of oxygen. Then, he narrowed his eyes. While running at high speed, he had already thrown away the gun on his shoulder. The powerful anti-material gun was not very useful against these latest Wolf Fang mecha models. The faint sound of wind and thunder came from the horizon. Several Empire's close-range fighter jets drew terrifying airflow lines as they rushed in this direction. Was this the final battle of his life? Narrowing his eyes, Su Li's heart was strangely calm as he watched the fighter jets in the sky and the Empire's special mecha coming from all directions. Other than the faint pride born from such a grand occasion, there was not even the slightest bit of fighting spirit in him. He took a deep breath and transferred the burning energy from his waist to his fingertips. He closed his eyes and recalled the crazy battle techniques his uncle had used in the Green Hills of Heshi Province. Those finger movements that could make the heavy mecha dance with the movement of his fingers despite being separated by thick armor. An instant later, he opened his eyes, a trace of a bitter smile on his face. Facing more than a dozen mecha and the fighter jets in the sky with his bare hands, as well as the densely packed Empire's troops further away, who could escape? After all, humans were not first-order machines. After all, he was not Uncle Fengyu. In this most dangerous moment, he also did not see Uncle Fengyu. The Wolf Fang mechs all around stopped their heavy footsteps, the cold gun barrels on their mechanical arms aimed at the small hill. The missiles under the wings of the Empire's fighter jets that were closing in at high speed in the sky left their jets and flew freely with the aura of death. At this moment, Su Li's eyes fell on the dusky sky above his head that was very similar to Donglin hometown. Across this sky, not far away, was the Federation's troops. Unfortunately, he could no longer go back. At this moment, the extraordinarily strange and colorful dust clouds due to pollution suddenly tumbled. A hole formed by high-speed air turbulence quickly formed. The dim light of the distant star became countless times brighter, shrouding the entire area around the mountain in gold. A strange dark-colored spaceship covered in tattered metal parts rushed out of the hole at a shocking speed like a metal monster from another time and space in this golden color. It slammed into the Empire's fighter jet that was firing missiles high up in the sky. The missiles first landed on the strange spaceship's body, bursting into a large ball of beautiful flames. Then, this seemingly burning spaceship smashed the Empire's fighter jet into pieces like rain in the sky. None of the Empire's soldiers who carried out this mission could describe the scene after the incident. No one could describe the flight path of that spaceship because according to the strict laws of physics, no one in this universe could withstand the high-speed turns of that strange spaceship. It was like a ghost turning at high speed. A gust of wind blew, the leaves swayed, and the mountain shook. More than 10 Empire's Wolf Fang mecha fell to the ground miserably. That strange, tattered spaceship roared and soared into the sky again, drawing a strange arc in the sky, avoiding the surface-to-air missiles of the Empire's ground base. It elegantly and arrogantly flew across the entire city. Then, the bow of the spaceship suddenly tilted, raised its head, and pierced through the clouds, flying towards that streak of golden light and disappeared in an instant. Su Lu, who was on the hill, had also disappeared. Chapter 657. All around them were metal components welded to the alloy walls and ground. There was no one in the spaceship, and there was no sound. Only the violent vibration and the shrill sound of the wind from the gaps of the broken metal could be felt. Only then could one feel the terrifying speed. The dilapidated spaceship that had broken through the colorful clouds was flying freely in the sky with a roar. For the people in the cabin, it was a terrifying torture. At this moment, Su Li's body had turned into a crazy stone, and he could not control it at all. He kept rolling up and down in the cabin, colliding with the hard and cold interior walls of the spaceship with many sharp corners, making dull crashing sounds. After an unknown amount of time, the broken spaceship finally returned to its normal cruising position. Su Lu, whose face was covered in blood and his body was covered in green, finally had a chance to catch his breath. His right hand tightly grasped a metal object that looked like an engine rack that he could not recognize and scanned the interior of the spaceship as quickly as possible. Blood dripped from his forehead and passed through his eyes, causing a certain degree of obstruction to his vision. The broken metal components welded to the interior of this strange spaceship made it even harder for people to see the original appearance of the spaceship, but Su Lu only took less than a second to recognize the origin of this spaceship. This was because more than a year ago, he had taken this tri-winged spaceship of the Bureau of Proclamation to heroically, or rather stupidly, break through the space channel. He had a deep impression of this spaceship that carried his determination for revenge. Even though its appearance had changed a lot, the aura inside was still there. A moment ago, he was waiting for death on the hill, and the next moment, he appeared on the tri-winged warship of the Federal Charter Bureau. This kind of abrupt change in circumstances made him, who had extremely strong nerves, stunned for a moment. Then, a silly and joyful smile appeared on his bloody face. The interstellar smugglers and pirates of the Empire could not understand this ghost ship, and neither could the Bureau of Proclamation of the Federation. Only Su Lu, who had been flirting with that great existence for many years, knew the reason. Since this tri-winged spaceship did not become a piece of trash in space but appeared in front of him, then, the old thing must be on the spaceship too. Escaping from death and returning home, the great joy made the silly smile on Su Li's face develop into a crazy direction. However, at this moment, the whistling sound of air tearing outside the spaceship that was penetrating the atmosphere at super high speed suddenly disappeared, and an absolute silence that made people instinctively panic shrouded the interior of the spaceship. Sulu felt that his body was gradually floating. He looked back in shock and saw that the gorgeous outline of the planet could be faintly seen outside the porthole. Only then did he understand that the spaceship had already passed through the atmosphere and was about to enter space. He opened his mouth and was about to say something to the strangely silent old thing, but he found that he did not make any sound. His chest was slightly rising and falling, but he did not inhale any air. He stared at the holes on the inner wall of the spaceship that seemed to be laughing at him. His pupils suddenly shrank, and he hurriedly closed his mouth, jumped to the closed door of the front cabin, and desperately knocked on it. The alloy door of the front cabin slowly opened. Sulu swam in without hesitation and tied himself to the seat near the observation window as fast as he could. Then he poked his finger up, closed the sealed door behind him, and pressed the button of the life support system. But what made him feel crazy and desperate was that the oxygen content in the front cabin was still decreasing bit by bit. Pulling out the life support mask on the side of the seat and putting it on his face, Sulu gasped a few times and shouted in shock, "What's wrong with the life support system?" Under the pressure of millions of tons of water in the Empire's Red Rose Royal spaceship, his body once again underwent a wonderful change. He did not need to breathe for a long time, or he could faintly breathe the oxygen in the water through his skin. However, at this time, the spaceship was in an environment that was close to absolute vacuum. If he stayed for too long, he would only die. No one answered his anxious and panicked question. A moment later, a mechanical electronic synthetic voice coldly sounded from inside the spaceship, "Request for identity verification." According to the Federation's laws and the Charter Act, if the identity verification is not passed, I will ask you to leave the spaceship after 20 Federation seconds. At this time, Sulu was like a drowning person who was holding the life support helmet tightly. After suddenly hearing this sentence, he could not help but be stunned. Then the resentment and ruthlessness that he had developed after a year of escaping suddenly burst out. He took off the life support mask and scolded angrily, "Stop playing games. You think this young master can't recognize you just because you're wearing a tattered vest?" After angrily scolding this sentence, Sulu caught a glimpse of a few dark figures that made his heart beat faster and faster on the side of the remote L9 planet that was getting smaller and smaller. They should be the Empire's regular fleet. Speed up. Speed up. Old man, get rid of these Empire people. Sulu waved his right arm vigorously and shouted loudly. However, the mechanical voice in the spaceship was still as cold and emotionless as before. It was still carrying out a cold and terrifying countdown. 103,102,101. Sulu was really stunned at this time. He held the bottom of the life support mask and looked at the equipment around the front cabin with a trace of confusion. It seemed that he wanted to find where the old man was hiding. His body gradually became cold. "I'm Sulu, 95, 94, I'm the 72nd anomaly. 88, 87, DDDDD, I'm your father." Suli's body was slightly cold as he pointed a middle finger at the light screen in front of him. "Leave the spaceship. Fly freely in space. Of course that would be death. What the hell is identity verification?" This mechanical synthesized voice seemed to have not been heard for a long time. Could it be that the old man was wandering alone in the universe, and his newly born IQ and EQ were miserably reduced to zero? Suddenly, he thought of something and frowned. A moment later, he took off his coat and covered his head. Then, he took a deep breath in front of the oxygen mask and resolutely put the bracelet on his wrist on the back of his neck. At this moment, Sulu felt like the guy in the Federation fable who covered his ears to steal the crystal chandelier. He didn't want the old man to discover his secret, but in this situation, what could he do? He could only hope that the thin coat could cover the glory of the charter. The intense pain on the back of his neck that he had only experienced twice but would definitely be unforgettable for the rest of his life once again occupied his whole body. Sulu painfully fell to the side of the chair with his clothes covered. His body trembled non-stop, but he forced himself not to fall unconscious with his strong mental strength. 34, 33, the mechanical synthesized voice inside the spaceship was still coldly counting down to death. As long as it or he or she wanted to, there were countless ways to make the painfully struggling man in the chair die. At this moment, a beautiful blue line suddenly flashed on the thick dust-covered light screen on the command console, making a soft beep. 28. Woo. Ah. Ah. Ah, the cold, mechanical, electronically synthesized voice suddenly twisted and changed pitch. The tones suddenly jumped up in the next moment, bringing with it a touch of extreme vicissitudes and rich emotion that made people cry, resounding in this spaceship that was as silent as a ghost in space. Oh. My God. Colonel Sulu, you son of a bitch are still alive. His palm carelessly wiped away the accumulated dust on the light screen. Sulu coughed hard twice. Looking at the few Imperial battleships on the monitor, he finally relaxed. He shook his head with lingering fear. Suddenly, he thought of something. He slammed the light screen and said angrily, "What identity verification? You came to L9 to save me, don't tell me you don't know who I am." The image of the old butler that he had not seen for a long time appeared somewhat distorted on the display light screen. He bowed slightly to him and replied with a smile, "First of all, I am only a part of myself. My core computing ability is too weak, and my reaction is much slower. Second, I have connected to some of the Imperial network in the past year, so I know that the Imperial people are spending a lot of effort to kill a person. Finally, it just so happens that I have recently obtained some key parts through some legal means. I am preparing to go to an abandoned mechanical warehouse on this planet for repair. Based on the above 3 points, I was just preparing to rescue that person and ask him. Of course, I have to admit that the 3D portrait I captured was the main reason for my action this time. It was a very long explanation, but it was not convincing. Of course, it could not shake Sulu out of his depressed mood. He angrily slapped his face that was still bloody and said, "An electronic portrait wanted by the Imperial people? Look who this is, you are not blind. It is not difficult for a human to disguise their face. Voice and fingerprints can also be imitated. Only the charter chip is the only reliable identity imprint." Sulu was silent for a moment before he said in a low voice, "That is not necessarily the case." The old butler on the light screen was also silent for a moment before he said with a hint of emotion, "Indeed." The slight sound of the electric motor and a few sparks broke the silence between the two. If the Federation charter computer could be called a person, the automatic mechanical hands were busy repairing outside the cabin door. The secondary sealing pressure around the front cabin and the repair of the life support system were also in progress step by step. Reuniting with the Federal Central Computer was equal to reuniting with the Federation and reuniting with the warmth of the past. After a moment of silence, Sulu fell heavily on his back and lay on the familiar seat. He took a deep breath tiredly and said softly with a satisfied smile on his face, "This tri-winged warship is too shabby. It feels like it can fall apart at any time. The light screen in the front cabin is full of ash from the engine oil. Even the life support system is broken. I really don't understand how you can still stand in front of me alive and kicking. In fact, I am more curious about what you have been through in the past year. It is even more incredible that you can still stand in front of me alive and kicking and even have the energy to raise your middle finger and scold me." The old butler in the form of charter computer replied calmly, "As for your question, it is actually very simple. I do not need to breathe. Naturally, I do not need to waste extra energy and components to maintain the life support system. I do not need to watch the surveillance, so I do not need to waste extra energy to clean the dust on the light screen. Sulu was silent for a moment before he said gloomily, "If this tri-winged warship was left in the Imperium to receive me when I left, then you threw away all these things as garbage. Did it not occur to you that I did not have your abilities and that I would become a dry corpse on the spaceship? Well, to be honest, I did not expect you to come back alive." After a long silence, the old thing continued with the warmth that it had only recently grasped. "I am very happy that you are still alive." "Me too." Sulu patted the image of the old butler on the light screen softly and said, "It is good to see you again." It was a little too sentimental, and it was sentimental between the intelligence of a human and a machine. There was always a nauseating feeling that surpassed the love between biological species. Sulu and Charter Computer realized this at the same time and shut up at the same time. The mechanical arm that was moving slowly on the right side of the front cabin, preparing to imitate human actions and give Sulu a warm and comforting hug, was also silently retracted. "Where have you been in the past year? How have you been?" Sulu suddenly asked with a smile, "Wandering alone in a foreign land, did you ever feel empty and lonely, and a little cold?" The old thing was clearly shaken to the core by this sentence. After a long silence, when Sulu was about to laugh heartily, a voice suddenly echoed in the quiet spaceship. "Do not ask me where I come from, where I come from, my hometown is far away, far away." Why are you wandering, wandering far away, wandering in the universe? In the vast and quiet space, a ragged metal spaceship brushed past the last asteroid belt of the L9 galaxy like a ghost and flew into the darkness further away. On this spaceship, there was a young man of the Federation who was facing the stars and covering his ears tightly. There was also a deep and magnetic male voice that was reciting ancient poems non-stop. Chapter 658. After the emotional recital, it was time for the legendary story. From the stories of drifting robberies, Sulu finally knew what this Bureau of Proclamation tri-winged spaceship had been through in the past year and turned into a pile of junk. At the end of the plan to assassinate Countess Katon, the MXT was shot in half by Peach Miasma. Sulu watched the tri-winged spaceship fly away in front of his eyes and unfortunately failed to get a return ticket. Then, the Imperium's flagship started to explode one layer after another. Sulu was heavily wounded and captured by Hui Chaosher and transferred to another warship. The tri-winged spaceship controlled by the old thing could not do anything when surrounded by the Imperium's fleet, especially when the Imperium's fleet started to chase after the tri-winged spaceship of the Bureau of Proclamation. It was forced to leave. The tri-winged spaceship left, but it did not leave. For some reason, the old thing did not let the tri-winged spaceship return to the Federation. Instead, it silently stayed in the Imperium and waited for Sulu's return. It had been more than a year. If Sulu was really dead and could never come back, would it continue to wait? In short, from that day on, this tri-winged spaceship without any crew members became a ghost in the southwest space zone of the Imperium. With its high speed and powerful navigation calculation ability, it wandered from one end of the southwest space zone to the other under the cover of countless dead stars. When its energy ran out, it started to rob. When the spaceship's mechanical failure could not be repaired, it started to rob. When the spaceship needed to be thickened to increase its collision force, it started to rob. The Imperium's fleet could not find the tri-winged spaceship that was deliberately hiding, and those smugglers and pirates could only sadly become the victims with only one pair of underwear left in front of the old thing's flawless plan and its high speed. The tri-winged spaceship's silent and determined wait in a foreign land was made up of endless loneliness and repetitive robberies. Like a naughty ghost, it tore off countless coats from the Imperium's spaceships and put them on itself layer by layer. Like a strange magnet, it absorbed a lot of scrap metal and turned the spaceship into this strange appearance. Although I know it's a little stupid to ask this, I really want to know. Sulu put his feet on the console and looked at the light beam that still had a few spots of dust. He frowned and asked solemnly, "Nobody is talking." You've been in the universe alone for more than a year. Do you really not feel bored? Earlier, he had asked a similar question, but this time, he was more serious and did not sound like he was joking. The charter computer seemed to have gradually gained some kind of human-like intelligence and emotions. This was something Sulu could not understand, but it was something he was concerned about. If the old thing was really becoming more and more like a human, then it would definitely be very difficult for him to endure a year of loneliness. I'm used to it. Although I'm not very sure if I was me before I met you, or if I would have the emotional reactions of a program like I do now, you should know that I've been alone for tens of thousands of years. The charter computer replied softly, me leaving the tri-winged spaceship in the Imperium is actually not in line with the result of the calculation. According to the calculation, you should be dead. But I don't know why, but I still stayed. Maybe it's because according to the sacred rule of the first charter, in this universe full of cold planets and rays, I can only communicate with you. Without you, I would have no one to talk to. Listening to the charter computer's calm self-analysis, Sulu had a lot of feelings. While he was struggling to survive in the Imperium, the tri-winged spaceship was wandering alone, trying to survive. It was a good feeling to have someone waiting for a wanderer who was thousands of miles away from home. If what was waiting for you was a ragged spaceship, it would be quite good too. What's the situation on the Federation's side? Where are the troops? After a short pause, Sulu immediately asked the situation he was most concerned about. The tri-winged spaceship has been drifting in this star field, unable to successfully activate any hidden signal relay stations. I don't know the situation on the Federation's side, the charter computer replied. But according to the feedback from the peripheral nodes of the Imperium's military intelligence network that I hacked, the Federation forces have completely occupied the Yellow Disaster star system. The command center should be planning a transition to the X3 star system. The speed of the Federation forces' advance was about the same as Su Li's calculation. During this year in the Imperium, especially from his conversation with Hui Chaosher, he could roughly guess the Imperium's strategic intentions. It was nothing more than using the vast space of the star field to delay or dilute the Federation's military pressure. And the information he knew about the Imperium's military made an invisible pressure appear in the quiet spaceship. We need to contact the Federation as soon as possible. Sulu rubbed his forehead, suddenly took out a chip, took the toolbox, and modified the Imperium's universal serial port before placing it into the reading device on the control panel. Looking at the reading device's linear display, he gently pursed his dry lips and said with a serious expression, "This is a piece of information given to me by the Imperium's underground resistance organization. There is no evidence, and it's a bit vague, but it should be related to the attack on the ancient bell. Before we came here, we already sent the information back to S1. The last seat of the Imperium should be dead, but for some reason, I feel like something is wrong." "What do you need me to do?" the old man asked. "Calculate this information from the Imperium. How did Keaton's fleet avoid your surveillance after passing through the Night Scorpion Nebula? I know the universe is too big, and there must be some omissions, but that damn fleet is too precise. It's like walking on a tightrope in the dark, but not a single step is off. It might be the information given by the seat of the Imperium. I'm more worried about the Bureau of Proclamation," Sulu said with a touch of seriousness. "After we go back, help me investigate." "We do need to go back. Although this tri-winged spaceship is equipped with the most advanced computing platform, its computing power is still seriously lacking, especially when compared to my home under the Bureau of Proclamation. The fact that I can maintain my current state is beyond the scope of my own calculations. I also feel that it's very strange. If the you on the spaceship is you, then who is the glory of the charter in the Federation? If it's also you, then there are two of you in this universe. This is a very troublesome philosophical question. My fundamental computing core is based on the quantum state, and there is no overly precise theory of causality in that scale space. It seems that I can only use inexplicable philosophical arguments to explain inexplicable physical facts, but this is not something that I, who is good at computing, can come to a conclusion. After a moment of silence, the charter computer continued, whether or not I will be devoured, and whether or not I will continue to have self-consciousness after the devouring is indeed a question. The reason why I have been wandering in the Imperium and refused to contact the Federation when I had the chance, is it because my core program has mutated and generated a biological instinct that makes me feel fear like you when you face death, thus silently pushing my logical analysis to develop in a direction away from the Federation? Sulu was also silent for a long time. Scratching his greasy hair hard, he said bitterly, "It's too long and too hard to say. Let's not continue this topic." It was obvious that the part of the charter computer left in the Imperium, the old thing, or one of the countless independent old things, was very happy to finally find an intelligent object to communicate with after waiting alone for a year. Therefore, it was not ready to end the philosophical debate that often troubled its self-consciousness after it was awakened. What ended the long and boring conversation was a dazzling light suddenly flashing outside the porthole and a sharp alarm that suddenly echoed in the long quiet environment. Warning! Enemy attack! The spaceship is under attack by high-speed weapons from outer space. Enemy attack! Sulu looked at the few terrifying beams on the light beam in shock, as well as the dozen or so Imperium warships marked with green light clusters right in front of the channel. Fear surged into his heart, and his wet hair was numb and itchy. The ragged Tri-Wing warship had already passed through the secret smuggling route in the L9 galaxy at this moment. After almost 13 hours of peaceful flight, Sulu almost forgot that he was still in the Imperium space zone and that he was still on the run. At the same time, the old thing on the Tri-Wing warship could not detect the Imperium's warships that were hiding behind the asteroid belts like hungry wolves in advance because of the lack of necessary equipment. Muen once said that the Imperium's military was now sweeping the smuggling routes in this space zone. Around the most secret space zone, there would be warships cruising at a high density. However, it was obvious that the Imperium's fleet that appeared in front of the Tri-Wing warship right now was definitely not for cruising. Staring at the dense green light spots that kept appearing on the light beam, Su Li's scalp was numb. Did the Imperium bring all their warships in the Southwest Galaxy here? He could not believe that those warships were all used to kill him. He subconsciously thought that he had accidentally entered the battlefield of a large-scale air battle. My life is too hard. Sulu sighed silently in his heart, and strangely, a feeling called boredom appeared in his heart. Escaping again and again was really tiresome, even if it was related to life and death, which was much higher than life and death. Under the control of the old thing, the Tri-Wing warship did not give him a chance to express his feelings at all. The engines that had been modified multiple times were all activated, and it suddenly turned around in space, narrowly avoiding the high-speed attack of the Imperium's cannons. Old thing, charge over there and smash these motherfuckers to death. Sulu narrowed his eyes and ordered in a low voice. The charter computer paused for a moment before replying confidently, "Motherfucker, you're not in a warship. There's no way I can transform this ragged Tri-Wing warship into a giant mothership even if I rob it for another 800 years. Smash your ass. Air, use everything you can to contact the federal forces and ask for backup. At the same time, send the relevant information back." And then, Sulu looked at the dense black and green warships of the Imperium on the light beam and felt a little cold. He said helplessly, "Let's hurry up and run." Today, the Federation forces stationed on the administrative planet of the Huang-E galaxy were filled with a somber and strange atmosphere. The generals of the headquarters landed in the base in the morning and gathered all the officers above the regimental level to begin planning the follow-up attack on the X3 galaxy. In the Federal Military Strategic Plan, the X3 galaxy, which was rich in crystal mineral resources but had never been fully developed due to the limited technological capabilities of the Imperium, was the most important part of the Imperium's invasion strategy. From the presidential palace of the S1 Capital Special District to the logistics soldiers of the lowest level of the frontline forces, everyone knew how important this pre-battle meeting was. The somber and hot-blooded atmosphere gradually heated up in every military facility in the base. However, in addition to this, there was also a strange atmosphere that began to spread in an extremely uncoordinated manner at this time. In the base conference room where the pre-battle military meeting was held, a pungent smoke filled the air. Almost every officer had a special cigarette between their fingers. The burning was either long or short, and they all had a cup of coffee in their left hand, either warm or cold. The expressions of these generals were all different. Some were silent, some were excited, and the expression of the new 17th Division commander, Yu Qinghai, was extremely ugly. Sitting in the middle, the Federation's frontline commander, General Yi Changtian, had an even uglier expression than Commander Yu Qinghai. His old but firm expression revealed a trace of intense dissatisfaction. His sharp eyes scanned the surroundings and coldly said, "This is war, not a fight between hooligans. This is a pre-battle military meeting that concerns the interests of the entire Federation, not some bullshit court of appeals. Since the verdict has already been passed, then there is no need to mention it anymore. We will immediately enter the official phase." In the face of such an important battle, the battle conference had to be brought forward because of a small matter that happened in the camp. The general's expression was naturally very ugly. Of course, even he knew that once any matter involved the Iron 7th Division and the new 17th Division, involved Du Shaoqing and that colonel who had already died, as well as those old grudges that were indifferently paid attention to in the dust of history, no matter how small the matter was, it would become a big matter. That was why he allowed Commander Yu Qinghai to make a brief speech on this matter. However, he would not allow this matter to affect the preparation of the frontline troops in any way. Execute the execution immediately. Commander Yu Qinghai heard the faint sound of the military order coming from outside the room, and his extremely ugly expression gradually returned to normal. As the commander of the new 17th Division, in order to protect his subordinates, he had already tried his best, arguing with reason. Even if there was no reason, he had argued until now. However, in the end, he still could not save the life of that officer named by Yulan. Lifting his cup and taking a sip of the cold coffee, Commander Yu Qinghai glanced indifferently at the person in front of him. Seeing that the lieutenant general wearing sunglasses did not seem to have any change in expression, Commander Yu Qinghai could not help but smirk mockingly. Then, he immediately focused his attention, and with the composure that an outstanding Federation general should have, he turned his attention to the giant three-dimensional star map in the middle of the meeting room. The Attack X-3 military plan, which had been deduced by the General Staff Headquarters and verified by the Federation Central Computer 3 times, was so detailed that it included the combat objective and direction of advance of each mecha team. It appeared simultaneously in the form of text on the annotation column at the bottom of the star map and on the military work platform of each general. As the military plan scrolled down, the visual color blocks on the three-dimensional star map of the enemy and their allies kept changing slightly. Commander Yu Qinghai held his coffee cup, his brows furrowed as he carefully watched the progress of the military simulation. He was analyzing the 25% mobility adjustment that his troops would have to undertake and how to deal with it. Suddenly, his furrowed brows relaxed inexplicably, and a puzzled expression appeared in his eyes. Almost at the same time, all of the high-ranking Federation officers, including Commander Yi Changtian, were stunned. They stared in confusion at the three-dimensional star map in the middle of the room. Even Commander Du Shaoqing, who could not change his expression even in the face of a collapsing iceberg, slowly took off the sunglasses on his nose. Because the three-dimensional star map that was continuously deducing the attack plan of the X-3 system suddenly stopped. Those color blocks that represented the Federation and the Empire's fleets, as well as land-based forces, disappeared at an extremely fast speed like snow in the hot sun. What was most shocking was that the three-dimensional star map actually began to adjust its angle of view on its own. Those planets and routes formed by the dots of light instantly shifted, arriving at a somewhat foreign background of the universe. This is a 65-degree view of the L9 system. The headquarters staff looked at this scene in shock, somewhat unable to believe his own eyes. He hurriedly lowered his head to look at the control panel in his hands and nervously explained, "Maybe there's a problem with the calculation program." Commander Yi Changtian's expression became more and more gloomy, but he did not get angry. He did not have time to get angry because everything that happened next proved that the strange scene before him was not a problem with the calculation program, but the Federal Central Computer believed that a very big problem had occurred somewhere in the Empire's star system. At this time, the main control panel of the base computer was completely out of the control of the staff officers. It completely gave up on the simulation of the X3 system's military plan and mobilized all of the calculation units. The dots of light on the matrix storage rack flickered rapidly. At the same time, a cold mechanical synthesized voice rang out from the conference room deep inside the base, the flagship outside the atmosphere, and even further away, the Federal fleet stationed at the periphery of planet Yellow Disaster. According to the authorization of the first charter, the orders are as follows. 1. The X3 system's military plan will be suspended indefinitely. The fleet stationed at the periphery of planet Yellow Disaster will be suspended from all missions. All troops will be loaded with ammunition and depart according to the following route to 367. 8329, 2788. After that, you will pass through 3 small warp voids. The specific space data is currently being calculated. The report will be submitted later. A clear navigation route appeared on the three-dimensional star map in the middle of the conference room. At the same time, an eye-catching dot of light indicated the location that the Federal Central Computer requested the Federal Fleet to head to. 2. All participating units are to be on standby. All mecha units are to be prepared to board the ship. Once the fleet fails to rescue the target, or if it is determined that it is impossible to rescue the target will enter a habitable planet and immediately engage in a forced landing battle. 3. The entire mission of this plan is to rescue the target and return. 4. The target is. The Federal Central Computer's mechanical voice paused for a moment. Old Butler Spaceship. This spaceship is a tri-wing spaceship under the Bureau of Proclamation. The relevant modification data will be updated later. The high-ranking officers in the Federal Forces Forward Base, the Bureau of Proclamation officials on the flagship, General Hong Yuliang, and the others in the Federal Fleet Command Hall were all shocked speechless when they heard these orders. What kind of bullshit is this? Commander Yi Changtian's eyes widened as he stared at the star map in front of him in shock. He said in disbelief, "Even the charter computer has a programming problem?" Where did a tri-wing spaceship from the Bureau of Proclamation appear in the L9 system? Even if a tri-wing spaceship that belonged to the Bureau of Proclamation suddenly appeared on the other side of the universe, all the Federation officers and hundreds of thousands of Federation soldiers present would never accept delaying the plan to attack the X3 system. They would not take the countless risks to carry out this baffling rescue mission in such a crazy and unprepared manner. "Do we have a signal relay station over there?" the commander asked angrily. "We just started to set up the net. Not many of the previous concealment devices can be activated," the staff officer replied. "Then what is going on?" At this time, no one thought of anything because of the name of the tri-wing spaceship from the Bureau of Proclamation. Only Commander Du Shaoqing's sword-like eyebrows furrowed, a hint of disbelief appearing between his brows. Warning, this is a first sequence incident. The Federal Central Computer completely ignored the shock, confusion, and anger of these high-ranking officers. Calmly, yet with an irresistible tone, it stated a fact that made everyone even more shocked and confused. Warning again, this is a first sequence incident. The Federal forces that had penetrated deep into the Empire's star region were all iron-blooded soldiers who had experienced hundreds of battles. These officers who stood in shock within the conference room had faced who knew how many dangerous situations in their lives on the battlefield, but they were all stunned by the words "first sequence incident." Not many people knew that the Federal Central Computer had killed that Eastwood mechanic. For most people in the Federation, they only knew that the Federal Central Computer had issued a first sequence incident once in their lives, and that was, several decades ago, the Empire invaded the West Woods. Could it be that the Empire's emperor suddenly died? Commander Yu Qinghai rubbed his messy white hair and guessed somewhat unconfidently. Then, he somewhat shamefully took a sip of coffee. Many people in the conference room were guessing all sorts of strange reasons. Only Du Xiaoqing calmly looked at the screen, knowing that the answer was about to be revealed. The three-dimensional star map blurred and dispersed, and an even more blurred image appeared. From the perspective, it should have been taken from the inside of a spaceship. The high-ranking officers of the Federation stared at the screen and found that the interior of the spaceship was extremely shabby. Then, they saw a face on the screen, a face that was still smiling so brightly and happily even though they had not seen each other for a long time. Seeing this face, Teacher Yu Qinghai spat out the mouthful of coffee that he had just drunk. The logistics department director was so shocked that he loosened his grip and the coffee cup fell to the ground. Then, a series of noises could be heard. Some people spat out coffee, some spilled coffee, and some dropped coffee cups. Because of the return of a certain person, the scene of the Federation's pre-war military conference turned into a sea of coffee. At this time, the internal affairs officer who had gone to carry out the military order returned to the conference room with an anxious expression. He was about to report the unexpected incident, but he found that the officers in the conference room had all turned into crimson statues. Only Du Xiaoqing remained calm, but if one looked closely, they would be able to see a hint of a smile and some indescribable feelings flashing in his eyes. He slowly placed the coffee cup on the table, looked at the blurred face on the screen, and sighed in his heart, "You're still alive? Then you have to come back alive." In a remote corner of the base was the execution ground for the execution of military law. In the past month, other than a Federation soldier who was executed for raping and killing 3 young Empire girls, no one else came here. However, because of the Federation officer who was about to be executed in the center of the execution ground, it became lively. The Federation soldiers were used to seeing life and death on the battlefield, so they were not like the citizens of the Empire's slums who were excited to see the execution scene. The lively scene was not because the soldiers came to watch the show. Many of the soldiers of the new 17th Division came to send Bai Yulan off. Gu Shifeng and the other former members of Group 7 anxiously waited for a miracle to happen. However, the sad thing was that Commander Yu's efforts did not yield any results, so naturally, there were no miracles. An officer from the Internal Affairs Department hurried over and passed through the crowd of gendarmes to read the verdict of the court-martial to Bai Yulan, who was in the middle of the execution ground. Bai Yulan nodded with some difficulty and then said a few words. Because they were too far away, the soldiers outside couldn't hear what they said. This corner of the base gradually became quiet. Many people were waiting for the gunshot, including Commander Dongfang and his subordinates who were standing furthest away. Their faces were covered in bandages, and their expressions were cold and filled with hatred. Gu Shifeng nervously looked at the military police in front of him. He watched as the military police slowly raised their guns and aimed at Bai Yulan. He took a deep breath, cursed, and exchanged a look with the members of Group 7 beside him. Then, he bravely walked out of the crowd. Robbing the execution ground? Dongfang Yu coldly looked in that direction and said in a vicious tone, "That's a plot that only exists in Schiller's old-fashioned novels. I really hope these bastards of Group 7 can be a little more impulsive. When the time comes, more than one will be executed." At this incomparably tense moment, a jeep sped over from the depths of the base. In the jeep, the regiment commander of the new 17th Division, He Lei, was waving his arms and shouting something loudly. Dongfang Yu narrowed her eyes and looked at the jeep that was rolling in a cloud of dust. She said mockingly, "Fuck, your acting is getting better and better." Do you really think that there's an imperial edict that allows you to keep your life? A few years later, when Bai Yulan looked at his smiling wife with a child in her arms, he would always remember that morning when he was facing the military police at the base on planet Yellow E. At that time, when he was facing death, he did not think too much about it. He only felt that his life was somewhat ridiculous. He did not know when it started, but he had changed from a professional soldier who believed in money to a newly married young man who did not care about violating military rules and injuring people. Yes, it was all the little boss's fault. Then, he suddenly heard cheers coming from all around the execution ground. The cheers were brought closer by a foreign wind, and they grew louder and louder until they reached his ears like a sudden clap of thunder. He raised his head with a frown and looked at the crowd with some resentment. He thought to himself, "Do you have to be so happy about my death?" Then, he realized that something was wrong. For some reason, the military police who were carrying out the execution put down the guns in their hands and cheered excitedly. What exactly happened? Federal Forces Forward Base, Flagship, Federal Fleet. All the soldiers who heard the news were cheering. Even the soldiers of the Iron 7th Division standing in the distance were applauding with smiles on their faces. Although that person had embarrassed their beloved division commander, on planet 5460 in the West Woods, that person had controlled a black MX and fought alongside the soldiers of the Iron 7th Division. That thrilling and heroic scene had remained in the hearts of many soldiers of the Iron 7th Division. These cheers from the bottom of their hearts proved one thing. Whether or not he was deliberately created as a war hero by the Federation government, that person had long become a role model in the hearts of the Federation soldiers through the things he had done. A rock did not need to speak. As long as it rolled over with great difficulty, it would naturally be able to press its way out. Commander Dong Fangyu slowly walked down the small slope with an ashen face. When the cheers gradually died down, he walked in front of the Internal Affairs officer and asked in a deep voice, "Why can't the execution be carried out? This is the verdict of the military court. Do you think it should be stopped because of some cheers?" The Internal Affairs officer looked at him with great difficulty and tried to persuade him, "Commander Dongfang, no one dares to overturn the verdict of the military court, but it's really not the right time to execute Bai Yulan. At the very least, it should be delayed for a while, right?" Just as Dong Fangyu was about to speak angrily, Gu Shifeng walked over and gently rubbed her round fingers. She smiled and said, "If old Bai dies today, I'm sure you know very well what will happen when the boss comes back." At this moment, the new and old members of Team 7 all rushed over and looked at him with mocking and disdainful gazes. Gu Shifeng's smile suddenly disappeared. She lowered her voice and said seriously, "Even if it's to protect your own little life, you better pray that old Bai is still alive before the boss comes back." Immediately after, the military order urged the cheering soldiers to run back to their respective camps. The military police, who were talking in shock, escorted Bai Yulan to the temporary prison. Bai Yulan looked around in confusion. He subconsciously wanted to flick the hair in front of his forehead, but he did not manage to do so. He looked at the group of people outside the police line who were beaming with joy and cursed, "Motherfuckers, what the hell is going on? The boss is still alive." The members of Team 7 excitedly reported this shocking good news to him. Then, they all returned to their respective camps, leaving behind Bai Yulan, who was speechless and staring blankly at them. The members of Team 7 did not say anything. They did not need to say anything. Their expressions showed how they felt at this moment. For them, if the boss was still alive, old Bai would naturally not die. As for the military regulations and court rulings, yes, these were all sacred things that could not be violated. Even they could not think of a way to save old Bai even if the boss came back alive, but, the past few years of fighting had made the members extremely determined. There was no reason, and even a trace of the unreasonable spirit unique to Team 7. They were convinced that as long as the boss came back, anything could be solved. Hearing this news, Bai Yulan stood there like a wooden statue for a long time. Then, he said to the military police beside him, "Brother, give me a cigarette." The military police looked at this lucky guy and smiled with a shrug. He lit a cigarette and put it in his mouth. Bai Yulan's lips trembled slightly. He took a deep breath and said vaguely but with incomparable certainty, "As a soldier, you should draw 37 cards." He thought that after Su Le died, he had stopped smoking. But today, he had started smoking again. Bai Yulan sighed with emotion. That guy who did not speak and only knew how to laugh foolishly seemed to have nothing to do with miracles. In fact, he was the best at creating miracles. Everyone thought that he was dead, but in the end? Yet, he had come back alive by announcing to the entire universe. With the cigarette in his mouth, Bai Yulan narrowed his eyes and tilted his head. He smiled and was silent for a long time. Then, he gently shook his head. At this moment, he did not think that he should be glad that he was still alive. He was only surprised that the guy was still alive. The so-called comrade in arms was probably a relationship between men who felt that the other person's life was more important than their own. If you're not dead after all this, then you have to come back alive. In front of the miracle of the hero's return, all the Federation soldiers were cheering. However, the situation was not like that. The words that Commander Du Shaoqing said in his heart showed that he had realized before anyone else that Su Li's glorious return to the Federation was definitely not a smooth journey. Otherwise, the Federal Central Computer would not have activated the first sequence of events. Now, the news that the federal military received only showed that Su Lu was still alive. It did not mean that he would definitely come back alive. The tentacles of the glory of the Charter had no way of reaching the L9 system. The reason that the tri-winged battleship that had drifted in the Empire's territory for a year was able to send back images was because they were extremely lucky to have activated 2 signal relay satellites that the Federation had aimlessly spread out several decades ago. The blurry and soundless images that were sent back intermittently showed that this tri-winged battleship of the Bureau of Proclamation was currently being pursued by the Empire's fleet. Although the federal military did not know that the extremely important princess of the Empire had sent out 2/3 of the battleships that the Empire's fleet used to cover the retreat of the Southwest system to encircle and annihilate them, the surveillance images that were occasionally sent back showed the densely packed silhouettes of the Empire's battleships. This made the generals in the base conference room know that the situation was very bad. Under the urging of the Federal Central Computer's first sequence of events, the fleet that had been preparing to attack the X3 system at the outermost edge of the Huangyi system had already set off. However, after calculating the distance between the two sides, especially with the incomplete data of the 3 warp holes, almost no one in the conference room believed that the extremely tattered tri-winged battleship would still be there when the Federal fleet arrived. After the cheers, there was endless silence. About a few minutes later than the front line, the sharp first sequence alarm also sounded in the Bureau of Proclamation building. In the office, old Director Tai and Assistant Chui Zhedong were both stunned when they saw the data feedback. The latter even thought of a very thorny problem. Immediately after, the news was sent to the President's official residence. After President Pabre was slightly stunned, he immediately stopped the joint staff meeting and rushed to the command hall with General Myers and other cabinet members as quickly as possible. Parliament Hill, which was in the middle of a closed-door discussion on the proposal of the temporary wartime budget adjustment, was temporarily adjourned after a series of shocked whispers between Vice President Xian and the chairman of the military committee. You're tuning in to the Blissful Bookshelf YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.